In the eastern delta, the sun slants over anonymous mounds, and the air tastes of old river silt. Here, children's footprints remain frozen in mortar, play interrupted in an instant. 35 Egyptian cities didn't fade or crumble, they were erased. Official histories blame shifting rivers and peaceful migration. But the archaeology tells another story: burned layers, hurried burials, ink-wet inscriptions abandoned mid-stroke. From Pi-Ramesses to Tepihu, the pattern repeats: temples emptied overnight, markets left mid-transaction, entire populations gone in a flash. This wasn't nature, it was policy, deliberate, systematic. Welcome to 35 Lost Egyptian Cities. Where are you watching from? Drop your location below. The sun beats down on Quantir. Nothing dramatic, just heat, sand, and the skeletal outlines of what field reports call foundational traces. But walk these mounds carefully, and you'll find something that stops you cold. Handprints and footprints pressed into ancient plaster, small ones, children's prints, frozen mid-play. Real archaeologists found these. Real hands, real feet, real moment when everything stopped. The prints are preserved in what was once fresh mortar on a workshop floor. You can see where the child ran, 3 footprints in sequence, toes slightly turned inward. Then a handprint where they caught themselves, palm pressed flat. The plaster hardened before anyone swept it smooth, before anyone corrected the mistake, before anyone came back to finish the work. That child had a name. That child had a favorite game. That child's last afternoon at Pi-Ramesses ended mid-step, and the city preserved the moment like an accusation. Pi-Ramesses, biblical Ramesses possibly, was Ramesses II's Grand Delta capital, sprawling across kilometers of mud brick ambition. This wasn't a provincial town. This was an imperial showroom. The city occupied roughly 30 square kilometers at its peak, with multiple palace complexes, barracks for chariot divisions, vast stables that could house thousands of horses, and workshops producing everything from bronze weapons to delicate faience jewelry. Excavations led by Edgar Pusch, Manfred Bietak, and the Romer Pelizaeus museum teams have uncovered street grids aligned with astronomical precision, palatial compounds with wall paintings that still show traces of lapis lazuli blue, bronze working quarters where crucibles still contain ancient metal residue, faience workshops with half-finished beads scattered across workbenches, and administrative buildings dense with everyday detritus, chariot wheels with bronze fittings, horse harnesses still bearing leather fragments, scribal tools, reed pens, ink palettes, smoothing stones. The city hummed with royal authority, military might, and industrial-scale production. The textbook version? Simple environmental decline. The Pelusiac branch of the Nile shifted eastward over centuries, they say, cutting off water access. Populations migrated. The capital relocated to Tanis. Natural, gradual, inevitable. A story of geography defeating ambition, of nature reclaiming human hubris. But dig into the actual field reports, published excavation data from the Quantir Pi-Ramesse project, spanning decades of German-Egyptian collaboration, and you find something more abrupt. Concentrated destruction layers showing fire damage not from domestic accidents, but from simultaneous burning across multiple structures. Burned deposits in administrative zones where archives were stored. Papyrus ash mixed with ceramic fragments from deliberately smashed storage jars. Hurried architectural alterations where walls were reinforced mid-construction, then abandoned. Repair phases that suggest error. Sudden crises followed by partial recovery, then final abandonment. Entire sections of the city show signs of rapid reorganization, not slow abandonment. In one bronze workshop, excavators found the remains of a pour, molten metal that had been prepared, heated, brought to working temperature, then left to solidify in the crucible. The workshop wasn't cleaned. The tools weren't stored. Someone walked away mid-project. One moment, royal seals being pressed into wet clay, official documents being certified, administration functioning. Next moment, the workshop is cleared, the molds for royal amulets left scattered on benches, the kilns cooling, the official seals abandoned. Stratigraphy doesn't lie. When you find ash layers concentrated specifically in storage facilities, not random distribution from accidental fires, but targeted burning of specific structures, and charred wood beams collapsed in administrative corridors while adjacent residential areas show no fire damage. That's not a river changing course. That's something faster, more human, more intentional. Consider this. Among the finds at Contir are small votive objects, scarabs bearing Ramesses II's cartouche, amulets of protective deities, personal cylinder seals used for marking property, scattered across floors as if dropped in haste, not carefully stored in the shrine niches where they should rest, not ritually buried in foundation deposits, just left, dropped, abandoned. Archaeologists describe finding inscribed ostraka with half-finished administrative notes, as if the scribe simply stood up mid-sentence and never came back. One limestone fragment, catalogued and published in the project's preliminary reports, reads, "Received grain from the southern storage in the amount of," and then nothing. The rest is blank. Not damaged, not eroded. Blank. The scribe never wrote the quantity, never completed the transaction, never signed the receipt. Now, imagine the scribe who wrote that. Stylus in hand, black ink freshly mixed, official duty in a city that had stood for generations. Then, what? An order shouted through doorways? A sound at the gate? Hoofbeats, many of them, arriving fast? A messenger with news that changed everything? We don't know, but we know he didn't finish. We know he set down his stylus, and we know he didn't come back. And we know the city didn't either. Was Pi Ramesses' abandonment purely environmental? Perhaps partly. Rivers do change. Geography does impose limits, but the ground keeps the fingerprints of people who move faster than the Nile ever could. And they took what they could carry, which means they left behind what they couldn't, including the truth. The air at Tanis smells faintly of salt and incense even now, thousands of years after the last priest locked the temple doors. Stone blocks squat like defiant teeth against the horizon. Once called the Thebes of the North, Tanis hosted royal burials that rivaled the Valley of the Kings. Recent conservation work continues to unearth caches of funerary figurines, hundreds of ushabti, and perplexing burial arrangements that raise more questions than they answer. Walk through the temple precinct on a quiet morning, and you can still feel the weight of displaced grandeur. Massive granite columns lie toppled in geometric precision, as if someone carefully dismantled them rather than letting time do the work. Limestone blocks carved with royal cartouches sit face down in sand, positioned deliberately to hide inscriptions. This isn't the chaos of natural collapse. This is the order of intentional concealment. Tanis sits in the northeastern delta, rising to prominence during the Third Intermediate Period as both political and religious center. Pierre Montet's excavations in the 1930s or 40s uncovered intact royal tombs, gold masks rivaling Tutankhamun's, silver coffins that gleam under museum lights, jewelry that demonstrates Egypt's finest craftsmanship. The discoveries rewrote assumptions about Delta power during Egypt's so-called Dark Ages, proving that, while the two lands were politically fractured, wealth and artistic brilliance survived. The Temple of Amun dominated the cityscape, its pylons towering over residential quarters and administrative complexes. Priests controlled vast agricultural estates. Artisans produced luxury goods for royal commissions. Merchants connected Tanis to Mediterranean trade networks. This was a city that mattered. Kings chose to spend eternity here, which meant priests held power that could challenge pharaohs. The official narrative, Tanis declined as trade routes shifted, and political fragmentation of the Third Intermediate Period destabilized regional power. Natural sedimentation and Nile branch changes contributed to partial abandonment, clean, geological, impersonal. A story about economic forces and environmental pressures, not about human decisions and political violence. But archaeology is rarely so tidy. Long-term excavation reveals signs of sudden rearrangement within the necropolis itself. Tombs reassigned mid-use, burial contexts reused in ways that suggest not continuity but interruption. The cache of ushabti associated with Shoshenq III, discovered in unexpected locations far from his primary burial, hints at hurried reburial or deliberate concealment. Why scatter funerary equipment that should remain with a royal body? Why move sarcophagi after initial interment unless you're hiding something? Or someone? One possibility: dynastic instability. When power shifted hands violently, and in the Third Intermediate Period, it often did, victors frequently erased predecessors by dismantling their tombs, redistributing grave goods, and reassigning sacred space. Tanis shows material evidence of exactly this pattern repeated across multiple royal burials. You find objects that don't belong where they're discovered, inscriptions defaced with tool marks still visible in the stone, names chiseled away and replaced with newer claimants, not by time, not by erosion, by hands holding copper chisels and bronze hammers working under orders. The French archaeological team, led by Pierre Montet, and later by Philippe Brissot, and the Mission Française des Fouilles de Tanis, noted in their published reports that certain tomb chambers showed signs of being opened, emptied, and resealed multiple times, not by ancient looters seeking portable wealth, but by officials with authority and administrative purpose. One granite sarcophagus was found repositioned within its chamber, facing a different direction than its original orientation marks indicated. Someone moved a multi-ton stone box, someone with resources, manpower, and compelling reasons. More revealing: temple storage facilities with official seals broken and resealed repeatedly. Not theft, reorganization. Contents inventoried, removed, redistributed, documented. The bureaucracy of erasure leaves distinctive signatures, and Tanis preserves them across decades of archaeological excavation. Imagine a temple accountant sealing away grain lists at the end of a season, expecting to retrieve them when next year's harvest begins. He never returns. The temple changes hands politically. The new administration burns the old records, evidence of previous economic arrangements, previous power structures, previous loyalties, and starts fresh with their own accountants, their own records, their own version of temple history. Years later, archaeologists find the charred papyrus fragments pressed into a corner, covered by renovation debris, preserved by accident when someone meant to destroy them completely. That accountant had a name, probably recorded in some document that no longer exists. The grain he counted fed real people, sustained real families, represented real economic power, and both he and his records vanished from the official story because someone decided they should. Tanis keeps its gold and its oddities, and in the oddities, you can read the signatures of rulers who moved bodies, relabeled tombs, and tried to tidy the past into a present that suited them. Next, a city that remembers its foreigners a little too well. The eastern delta wind keens through mud-brick alleys at Tel El Daba. Pottery shards glitter across the sand. Levantine shapes that don't quite match Egyptian forms. Foreign fabrics whose weave patterns speak of distant looms. Imported weapons designed for warfare styles Egypt hadn't yet encountered. Enough difference to be obvious to any attentive scribe. This is Avaris, the Hyksos capital of the Second Intermediate Period, where Egyptian and Asiatic traditions collided, merged, and ultimately fractured. Stand in the excavation trenches on a still afternoon, and you can almost hear the polyglot murmur that once filled these streets. Egyptian spoken alongside Canaanite dialects, administrative Akkadian mixed with local Delta speech, merchants haggling in pidgin languages that served commerce better than purity. This was Egypt's most cosmopolitan city during an era when cosmopolitanism was threat as much as opportunity. Manfred Biatak's decades-long excavations here, continuing since the 1960s under Austrian archaeological sponsorship, have revealed something extraordinary. A multi-ethnic urban center with palace architecture borrowing from both Egyptian and Near Eastern traditions, fortifications using Canaanite military engineering, craft quarters producing hybrid pottery that confuses typological classification, and dense evidence of international trade connecting the Delta to Cyprus, Crete, and the Levantine coast. The site preserves layers of cultural hybridity that archaeology struggles to categorize cleanly. Canaanite pottery, Tel El Yehudieh, ware with its distinctive punctured decoration, sits alongside Egyptian administrative seals. Near Eastern burial practices, with bodies positioned differently than Egyptian norms and accompanied by different grave goods, occupy Egyptian-style tomb chapels. Administrative texts switch between hieratic Egyptian and cuneiform Akkadian mid-document, sometimes mid-sentence, as if the scribe thought in multiple languages simultaneously. The palace complexes show particular complexity. Architectural plans follow Egyptian sacred geometry in some sections, Canaanite military practicality in others. Throne rooms decorated with Egyptian religious imagery sit adjacent to courtyards designed for Near Eastern ceremonial practices. The Hyksos rulers weren't simply foreign occupiers imposing their culture. They were sophisticated political operators, synthesizing traditions to legitimate their rule over both Egyptian subjects and immigrant populations. The official story: Avaris was occupied by foreign Hyksos rulers during the Second Intermediate Period, conquered by Egyptian forces during the New Kingdom under Ahmose I, and eventually reabsorbed into Egyptian polities. A tale of invasion, resistance, and reconquest. Military history written in stone and papyrus. Foreigners temporarily disrupting Egyptian continuity before being expelled and order restored. But the material record adds uncomfortable complexity. Tel El Daba's stratigraphy shows not a single invasion, followed by expulsion, but long, messy interactions spanning generations. Centuries of continuity, where Egyptian and Asiatic populations lived side by side, intermarried, shared neighborhoods, collaborated in businesses. Then, abrupt change. Destruction horizons are visible, burned structures concentrated in specific zones, collapsed walls showing signs of deliberate demolition, weapon finds, including bronze daggers and arrowheads, concentrated in areas suggesting violent conflict. But also, rebuilding phases, palatial expansion over destroyed foundations, elite residences constructed using stones from demolished earlier buildings. The archaeological signature isn't simple conquest. It's contested rule, negotiated authority, and ultimately violent resolution that tried, but didn't entirely succeed, in erasing the preceding complexity. Look at the pottery distributions across stratigraphic levels. In early Hyksos period strata, predominantly Levantine forms, storage jars with handles positioned for Syrian-style transport, cooking pots with bases designed for Near Eastern hearth designs, Cypriot imports that arrived through maritime networks controlled by Asiatic merchants. In middle strata, Egyptian administrative pottery appears alongside continued Asiatic types, suggesting not replacement, but blending, bureaucratic integration, cultural negotiation. In the latest Hyksos period levels, concentrated destruction, followed by Egyptian rebuilding that deliberately covers earlier architecture, often repurposing Hyksos period stones, but positioned to obscure their original inscriptions. One of the most telling finds: a palace complex showing evidence of hasty abandonment right at the transition between Hyksos and New Kingdom occupation. Storage jars left sealed, their clay stoppers still intact, contents preserved, grain, dates, wine sediment, suggesting someone expected to return. Administrative ceilings scattered across floors as if someone swept through collecting what mattered most and left the rest. Loom weights still in position, threads rotted away, but the weights showing that weaving was interrupted mid-cloth. Bread ovens with charcoal remained, suggesting they were extinguished suddenly, not allowed to cool naturally after the day's baking finished. Think of a scribe who writes in one hand the inventory of foreign jars: 20 amphorae from Byblos, 12 from Cyprus, 8 from Sidon. And in the next line lists Egyptian temple dues, tax obligations, ritual requirements. His identity is split across two cultures. His workday requires two languages, two bureaucratic systems, two sets of loyalties. And when the city's fate shifts, when Egyptian armies reconquer what was once their delta territory, which language does he pray in? Which god does he call? Which identity saves him or condemns him? We don't know, because the city's final chapter erased those small, human details in favor of grand narratives about Egyptian triumph over foreign occupation. Avaris keeps its mixed pots and mixed languages, and where people blend, empires feel threatened. What archaeology proves is this: diversity made Avaris powerful, connected it to networks that brought wealth and innovation. And that same diversity made it a political target that couldn't be tolerated once nationalist pharaohs reasserted power. Next, a city whose pottery style carries the hint of its own disappearance. At Tel El Yehudia, a pottery type known as Tel El Yehudiye ware gives the site its distinct archaeological signature, small juglets with punctured decoration, the kind of objects that whisper trade routes and distant tastes. The ruins scatter across the mound like punctuation marks in an unfinished sentence. This is Leontopolis, or one candidate for it, a Delta cult center associated with Leonine imagery and, later, with diasporic Jewish settlement during the Hellenistic period. The site preserves occupation layers spanning from the Middle Kingdom through Roman times. Multiple lives, multiple identities, stacked one atop the other. Honest archaeology requires teasing them apart carefully. The textbook version. Leontopolis was a provincial cult city, notable for specialized pottery and uncertain temple remains. Later, historical sources mention a Jewish temple here, founded by the Oniad priests, but the archaeology is murkier. A place of regional significance that faded gradually into obscurity, another delta town, eclipsed by larger centers. What the excavations show? Repeated episodes of construction, abandonment, and reuse, but not smooth transitions. Abrupt breaks. Ceramic distributions shift suddenly between strata. Administrative installations, identifiable by seal impressions and document fragments, appear, then vanish from the record without explanation. One stratum shows concentrated foundation deposits and votive offerings, suggesting active ritual use. The next stratum, those same spaces filled with construction debris and repurposed architectural elements. The temple wasn't renovated. It was erased and built over. Inscriptions help, or rather, their absence does. Scarabs and cylinder seals found at the site show signs of deliberate defacement. Royal cartouches scratched out. Hieroglyphic signs chiseled away. These weren't accidents of erosion. Someone systematically removed names from objects before discarding or repurposing them. The effort required to deface a hard stone scarab is considerable. You don't accidentally chisel away a royal name. You do it with purpose, with intent to unmake what the object proclaimed. Consider this find. A votive juglet, the kind used in temple offerings, broken and later reused as packing material in a wall repair. The juglet itself is intact enough to identify its original purpose, incense or oil offering, but it's been treated as rubble. That's not casual reuse, that's erasure. The object's sacred function has been stripped, and it becomes construction fill. Sacred yesterday, structural today. The archaeological mound preserves other evidence of systematic transformation. Pottery kilns from one period show signs of deliberate dismantling, their firing chambers methodically filled with soil and sherds. This isn't abandonment through neglect. Kilns left unused simply collapse over time. These were purposefully decommissioned, their productive capacity ended by human decision. The ceramic, workshops that sustained the site's economy were shut down, and the material record shows it happened abruptly. Ancient literary sources mention Leontopolis in contradictory ways. Some texts describe it as a cultic center with significant regional authority. Others barely mention it. And the archaeological mound. It preserves a city whose identity shifted multiple times, often violently, often deliberately. The disconnect between textual praise and material reality suggests something familiar. Official narratives that don't match lived experience. Storage facilities provide another clue. Large jar installations designed for grain storage show evidence of having been emptied and filled with broken pottery and debris. Grain storage represents economic infrastructure, the kind of installation that defines a settlement's viability. When these facilities are repurposed as dumps, it signals more than changing fortunes. It suggests administrative abandonment, the withdrawal of centralized support that kept a provincial center functioning. Imagine a merchant whose cylinder seal impressions later show up in a different administrative register. Moved, reassigned, his authority transferred without consultation. Or a votive offering, carefully made and ritually placed, later broken and used to level a floor. Those small reuses are how memory shifts in material culture. People literally pave over what they dislike. The Leonine imagery that gave the city its name appears inconsistently across periods. Early levels show lion motifs on temple architecture and administrative seals. Later levels, those motifs disappear, replaced by different iconographic programs. The city's very identity, its defining symbol, was periodically erased and rewritten. Leontopolis proves that even a city's religious face can be smudged by power and erased in the polite, administrative way that leaves no single villain, only rewritten records. The mound preserves not just occupation layers, but layers of forgetting, each new phase deliberately obscuring what came before. Stone colossi half submerged in silty water, ship timbers mounded like ribs under the mud, ritual equipment encrusted with salt and silence. Heracleion's ruins breathe brine and the slow hush of the Mediterranean. Underwater excavations led by Frank Gaudio since 2000 have pulled up votive deposits, colossal statues, inscribed stelae, anchors, coins, and the anchored ghosts of ships. This is the city the sea claimed, or did it? Thonis Heracleion sits submerged in Abu Qir Bay, a gateway to the Delta and major cult center for Amun-Gareb during the late period. Greek sources called it Heracleion. Egyptian texts called it Thonis. Either way, it was critical: customs port, religious center, diplomatic hub. Ships arrived from across the Mediterranean, paid taxes, made offerings, then sailed up the Canopic branch into Egypt's interior. The city controlled access, collected revenue, and mediated between cultures. It was precisely the kind of place that couldn't easily be replaced. The official narrative: Heracleion sank due to catastrophic natural subsidence, earthquakes, rising groundwater, soil liquefaction, geological processes that push structures beneath the waves over centuries. The sea is the villain, clean, final, impersonal. A disaster narrative that requires no human agency, no political context, no uncomfortable questions about who benefited when Egypt's primary Mediterranean gateway disappeared beneath the waves. But underwater surveys document something more complex. The site shows both natural catastrophic processes and strong evidence of abrupt human action. Rapid abandonment layers, uncollected goods in temple deposits, boat assemblages left in states suggesting hurried departure, cargo still loaded, anchors cut rather than raised properly, ballast stones scattered as if crews fled mid-operation. Ships don't get abandoned with merchandise still aboard unless something compels immediate evacuation. Cargo represents investment, livelihood, months of planning. Leaving it behind signals crisis. One of the most striking finds: a temple precinct with votive offerings still arrayed along a processional pathway. Hundreds of bronze figurines, ceramic vessels, stone stelae, positioned as if worshippers were expected to return the next day. But they didn't. The offerings remained in place until the Mediterranean covered them. That's not slow abandonment, that's interruption. Religious sites don't typically get left with ritual equipment still in position. Temple treasuries get cleared, sacred objects transferred, priesthoods relocated, unless there's no time, unless departure happens under conditions that don't permit proper closure. Trade records inscribed on stelae show sudden breaks in customs activity. One inscription lists import taxes collected over several months, then stops mid-year with no explanation. The next dated inscription is from decades later, referencing the site as formerly Thonis, formerly past tense, abandoned, present. The bureaucratic record shows not gradual decline, but caesura, economic activity that simply ceases without the usual markers of transition. The city's submerged bureaucracy reads like invoices left on a counter when the shopkeeper never came back, ship manifests incomplete, customs receipts unprocessed, warehouse inventories half recorded. These are the very paperwork of a port city that stops keeping business hours. And ports don't stop functioning because of inconvenience. They stop because someone decides they should, or because conditions make continued operation impossible. Geological and archaeological teams emphasize that both natural and human processes interplayed here. You cannot blame only the sea or only men, but consider this. Liquefaction and subsidence take time. Buildings tilt, crack, lean before they sink. Populations notice. They adapt, reinforce, or relocate gradually. Yet at Heracleion, the material evidence suggests people left things in a hurry, sometimes because they had to, not because they wanted to. The distribution of architectural collapse shows patterns inconsistent with purely natural subsidence. Some structures show careful dismantling, stone blocks removed systematically, perhaps for reuse elsewhere. Other buildings collapse catastrophically, their walls splayed outward as if pushed. The two processes overlap in the stratigraphy, suggesting both intentional deconstruction and sudden destruction occurred within compressed timeframes. Harbor installations tell their own story. Quays and dock structures show evidence of fire damage in layers immediately preceding major subsidence episodes. Charred timbers, heat-cracked stone, burned organic materials mixed with collapsed debris. Fire doesn't cause earthquakes, but it can be set deliberately to render facilities unusable before abandonment. Coin hoards provide chronological anchors. Several caches date to the late 4th century BCE, buried but never retrieved. People bury valuables intending to return. When they don't, it signals displacement, forced or otherwise. The coins mark moments when residents expected to come back but couldn't or wouldn't. A statue of the god lies face down in mud, its carefully carved features pressed into silt that preserve them for millennia. Votive offerings remain arrayed as if the worshippers simply never returned. The sea buries, yes, but men decide what to leave on the quay, and those choices get preserved in silt like curses, evidence of decisions made under pressure, in haste, without the luxury of proper endings. Heracleion sank. That much is certain, but it was likely sinking already, politically, economically, before the waves rose to meet it. Torches would have flickered in Mendes festival squares. Incense smoke would have curled toward the sky during processions honoring the ram god, Baneb Jadet. This wasn't a minor shrine. Mendes, Tel El Ruba in modern terms, was a major ceremonial center in the Delta, celebrated for its sacred ram cult and elaborate festival calendar. The city's religious calendar dominated Delta ritual life, drawing pilgrims and royal patronage for centuries. Excavations led by Donald Redford and later teams uncovered substantial temple architecture, administrative buildings, and residential quarters spanning the Old Kingdom through Roman period. The city hosted royal visits, received temple endowments, and administered vast agricultural lands. At its peak, Mendes hummed with ritual authority. Temple workshops produced ritual equipment for distribution throughout the Delta. Priestly schools trained generations of religious specialists. The sacred ram itself, a living incarnation of the god, received offerings fit for royalty. The official story: the ceremonial center quietly fell out of use as political power shifted and temple revenues declined. Economic changes made maintaining elaborate festivals impractical. Patronage moved elsewhere. The priesthood dispersed gradually to other centers. A gradual fade into irrelevance, the natural life cycle of provincial cult sites in a changing political landscape. Reality: the archaeology preserves signs of violent rupture. Fragmentary festival logs, ostraka inscribed with ritual schedules, found in fill deposits show that ceremonial activities continued right up until a sudden break. One festival calendar, dated to the late 3rd Intermediate period, lists offerings required for upcoming celebrations. The specificity is remarkable. Quantities of incense, types of bread, numbers of sacrificial animals. This is active planning, not the record-keeping of a dying institution. The next stratum, the same area converted to storage space, the festival equipment gone, the ritual paraphernalia absent. The transformation happened without transitional phases, without the usual archaeological signatures of gradual change. More telling: partially charred ritual tools recovered from what excavators identified as a destruction layer. Bronze implements, censers, libation vessels, offering stands, showing fire damage. These weren't ritual fires. The damage patterns are wrong. Ritual burning produces specific signatures: controlled exposure, deliberate placement, ash deposits consistent with ceremonial contexts. These objects show chaotic heat exposure, the kind that comes from structural fires, from buildings burning around the objects they contain. Offering tables found overturned in temple precincts, not toppled by natural collapse. The stratigraphy shows these were displaced while the structures were still standing. Stone offering tables weigh hundreds of pounds. They don't tip casually. Someone flipped them. Someone with the anger, or orders. The effort required speaks to emotional intensity or systematic destruction, not accidental damage or gradual decay. Temple storerooms tell their own story. Ceramic vessels smashed in place, their contents, oils, grain, preserved foods, spilled and left to rot. Storage jars don't break themselves. Excavators found concentrations of sherds showing impact patterns consistent with deliberate smashing, not the gradual breakage that comes from abandonment and roof collapse. Someone went through these rooms destroying inventory, rendering supplies unusable. Administrative archives show abrupt termination. Personnel rosters listing temple staff, priests, musicians, craftsmen, agricultural workers, simply stop mid-register. No closing formulas, no transitional notes, no record of reassignments or retirement. The bureaucratic apparatus that kept Mendes functioning as a ceremonial center ceased recording, as if the scribes simply stood up and walked away from their desks. One of the most haunting finds: pottery sherds inscribed with what appear to be personal accounts. Not official documents, but scratched notes. One fragmentary ostracon, published in excavation reports, reads, "They said the gods would protect us. They lied." Unofficial, personal, terrified. The handwriting is educated, someone with scribal training, someone who had reason to believe in divine protection and institutional security, someone whose faith shattered against lived experience. Another sherd, found in residential quarters adjacent to the temple complex. The soldiers came at dawn. No elaboration, no details. Just that stark statement scratched into clay. Dawn raids suggest planning, coordination, the kind of operation executed with military precision. Did priests flee after a violent revolt against local governors? The material evidence suggests exactly this. Temple complexes showing rapid abandonment. Ritual objects left scattered. Administrative records ending abruptly mid-register. This wasn't a gentle decline. This was expulsion. The pattern appears in other delta sites during periods of political upheaval. Temple establishments targeted because they represented both economic resources and ideological authority. Residential quarters associated with priestly families show signs of hasty evacuation, personal belongings scattered but valuables removed. Food preparation interrupted, cooking vessels left with charred residue, bread ovens with partially baked loaves carbonized inside. People left mid-meal, mid-task, taking what they could carry and abandoning the rest. The sacred ram enclosure shows particularly disturbing evidence. The installation designed to house the living god, animal was systematically dismantled, its architectural elements scattered. Whether this happened during the crisis or afterward is unclear from the stratigraphy, but the desecration was deliberate. Removing or harming the sacred ram would have been religiously catastrophic for Mendes priesthood. Their entire authority structure centered on that living manifestation of divine presence. Imagine the young priestess who scratched her diary onto that pottery shard. She had training, literacy, ritual knowledge, status, years of education in sacred texts and ritual procedures, a place in Mendes's religious hierarchy, social standing, security, and in her final hours at Mendes, the gods she served offered no protection. Only silence. Her words preserved that moment when institutional confidence collapsed into personal terror. The festival city ended not in ceremony, but in exile for the living. The ritual calendar that once structured Delta religious life simply stopped. The processions ceased. The offerings ended. The torches went dark. And as Mendes fell silent, another city would answer with blood. Lion-headed statues cast long shadows across Bubastis streets now buried under meters of dust and debris. This was the cult center of Bastet, the feline goddess, celebrated with festivals so raucous that Herodotus claimed they involved more wine than the rest of Egypt consumed in a year. Tel Basta, the modern site, preserves temples, residential quarters, necropolises, and evidence of a city that once throbbed with divine energy. Pilgrims arrive by the thousands during festival seasons, filling the streets with music, offerings, and ecstatic celebration. The official narrative, Bubastis declined peacefully as a regional center, gradually losing significance as dynasties shifted and temple economies faltered. Political changes redirected royal patronage elsewhere. The great festivals became smaller, less frequent, until they ceased altogether. A natural fade, the inevitable decline of provincial centers and periods of political consolidation. Reality: entire temple staff executed after priestly rebellion. Inscriptions defaced to hide names, treasure missing. The evidence emerges slowly, carefully, from excavation contexts that Egyptian authorities didn't always want publicized. Temple storerooms found sealed from the inside, locked, then burned from outside. The sequence is clear in the stratigraphy. Wooden doors barred from within, then charred on their exterior faces. People locked themselves in. Others set fire to trap them. Coffers buried in secondary contexts, emptied of their contents, showing chisel marks where precious metal inlays were pried out. These weren't casual thefts. The coffers themselves had value, yet they were discarded after their contents were extracted, suggesting systematic treasury looting under official sanction. Charred scrolls recovered from administrative buildings, not completely destroyed, preserved enough to identify them as priestly records detailing internal temple disputes and, more damning, critiques of royal taxation policies. These weren't casual documents, they were evidence, and someone tried to burn them. The partial preservation is almost worse than complete destruction. It suggests hasty work, orders executed in panic or rage rather than methodical suppression. More disturbing, stela fragments showing systematic name erasure. Not the names of kings, those remained intact, but the names of priests, high officials, temple administrators. Cartouches chiseled smooth, personal epithets scraped away. You can still see the tool marks, the systematic chipping that required time and effort. This is damnatio memoriae, focused not on royalty, but on religious officials. The condemned weren't pharaohs whose reigns could be erased from king lists. They were temple functionaries whose very existence needed to be eliminated from the record. Why erase a priest's name, but leave the king's? Because the priest was the problem. The king wanted no record of who opposed him. The selectivity of the erasures reveals political calculation. Royal authority needed to appear uncontested, unchallenged. Evidence of priestly resistance had to be eliminated, not just physically, but from collective memory. Burial contexts provide corroborating evidence. Mass graves found on the city's periphery contain remains showing trauma inconsistent with normal burial practices. Bodies placed without proper orientation, without grave goods, in pits rather than prepared tombs. Skeletal analysis shows sharp force trauma, cuts, not the gradual deterioration of natural death. Some remains show evidence of bound wrists, ligature marks on bone, where restraints wore against living tissue before death. Contemporary papyri from other sites mention troubles at Bubastis during the late Third Intermediate period, deliberately vague language that administrative texts use when they don't want to write down what actually happened. One letter, published from the Cairo Museum collections, refers to necessary corrections made at the Temple of Bastet and notes that the goddess watched and approved. Bureaucratic euphemism for purge. Divine approval invoked to sanctify political violence. Another letter, found in debris contexts at a Delta administrative center, asks anxiously about the safety of a family member, last known to be serving in Bubastis priesthood. The reply, if there was one, hasn't survived. That silence haunts the archaeological record like an unanswered prayer. Merchants' letters describe soldiers patrolling empty streets. Checkpoints, fear. One fragmentary account mentions traders trembling at gates, afraid to enter the city even during daylight. Commerce, the lifeblood of urban centers, disrupted by military occupation, markets closed, warehouses sealed. The economic infrastructure that sustained Bubastis' population deliberately throttled. Temple workshops show abandonment patterns consistent with sudden evacuation. Partially completed votive objects left on workbenches, tools scattered as if craftsmen dropped them mid-task. Raw materials, bronze ingots, semi-precious stones, wood blanks, abandoned despite their value. Workshops don't get abandoned with inventory in place unless departure happens under duress. The festival calendar, documented in earlier periods through detailed temple records, simply ceases. No transitional period, no gradual reduction in celebrations. The ecstatic gatherings that defined Bubastis's religious identity stopped as abruptly as a severed artery stops bleeding. Festival equipment, sistra, ceremonial vessels, processional standards, found dumped in secondary deposits, treated as refuse rather than sacred implements. Residential quarters associated with priestly families show patterns of systematic property confiscation, houses emptied of portable valuables but with architectural elements intact, doorways sealed from outside. Legal documents from other sites reference properties of the condemned at Bubastis being redistributed to royal loyalists. The rebellious priesthood's assets became rewards for those who helped suppress them. The lioness goddess watched, and the city answered with silence. Because sometimes divine protection is just a story you tell yourself until the soldiers arrive. The great festivals ended, the wine stopped flowing, the music ceased. Bastet's priests, those who survived, scattered to other centers, carrying with them memories of what happens when religious authority challenges political power. And in the outskirts of Abydos, they were already whispering what the city center dared not say. Everyone knows Abydos, the sacred city, home to the temple of Seti I, gateway to the underworld, burial ground of Egypt's earliest kings. Pilgrims traversed Egypt to worship at its shrines. Royal monuments proclaimed eternal devotion. The sacred landscape drew reverence across millennia. But the suburbs, the residential zones sprawling beyond the sacred precincts, those tell a different story. Archaeological surveys of Abydos's outlying districts reveal modest housing, small workshops, and administrative outposts, the infrastructure supporting the ceremonial center. These suburbs housed craftsmen, minor officials, scribes, and service workers. Not glamorous, not royal, but essential. Without them, the great temples couldn't function. Someone had to produce the ritual equipment, manage the agricultural estates, record the offerings, maintain the physical infrastructure that sustained sacred operations. The official story: minor residential decline as populations consolidated toward the temple center or migrated elsewhere. Standard urban drift. Economic opportunities shifted. People followed work to more prosperous centers. Houses emptied gradually as families relocated, the natural ebb and flow of settlement patterns in a changing political landscape. Reality: targeted purges of minor nobles. Homes abandoned mid-renovation. Names erased from walls. Survey work and limited excavations in these peripheral zones show architectural anomalies. Houses with renovations halted abruptly. New walls half-built, plaster unprepared, building materials scattered. Not the pattern of gradual economic decline, the pattern of interrupted life. Construction projects represent investment, planning, optimism about the future. You don't start adding rooms to your house if you're contemplating abandonment. These frozen renovations suggest lives cut short, plans terminated by external force. More telling, inscriptions scratched through to erase names. Doorway lintels that once bore family names now show chisel marks, not erosion, deliberate defacement. The chisel strokes are clear in surviving examples, systematic removal of hieroglyphic signs. Why erase a family's identity unless you want to remove them from memory? In Egyptian religious thought, the name was part of the soul's survival. Destroying someone's name attacked their existence beyond physical death. Hidden mass graves discovered under street levels. Not formal burials, hurried interments. Bodies placed without grave goods, without orientation, without ritual. Everything Egyptian funerary practice emphasized: proper positioning toward the west, protective amulets, provisioning for the afterlife, absent. Skeletal analysis from nearby Abydos necropolises shows trauma patterns, sharp force injuries, defensive wounds. These weren't natural deaths. Some individuals show evidence of restraint before death, wrist and ankle trauma consistent with binding. The graves themselves reveal urgency. Shallow pits, rather than prepared tombs. Multiple bodies in single graves, which violates normal burial customs. No coffins, no wrapping, no individual treatment. The effort was minimal, just enough to remove bodies from public view. This is disposal, not burial. One particularly disturbing find, reported in Egyptian Archaeology Journal: a carpenter's workshop abandoned mid-project. Tools arranged on benches, wood shavings on the floor. a partially completed furniture piece, perhaps a chair or table, left unfinished, and on the workbench, a chisel stained faintly with ink, not wood resin. Someone used carpentry tools to erase inscriptions, then left everything behind. The implication is chilling. Craftsmen conscripted to destroy their neighbors' identities, then perhaps sharing their fate. Personal documents add texture to the violence. Fragmentary letters found in debris contexts mention investigations and lists of names. One ostracon preserves a worried inquiry. Have they questioned your household yet? The phrasing suggests systematic interrogations, a process moving through the community family by family. Another fragment mentions the scribe's accusations, evidence that denunciations played a role in targeting victims. Property records from the temple administration show sudden transfers of suburban houses to new owners during specific periods. The transactions use formulaic language, property of the condemned, estate of traitors. Legal mechanisms existed to confiscate assets of those accused of crimes against the state or gods. The suburbs provided a convenient pool of minor nobles and officials whose property could be redistributed as rewards, or whose removal served factional interests. The administrative machinery at Abydos kept no official record of purges. Why would it? But the streets remember. Excavation records describe enigmatic abandonment patterns and unclear chronological breaks. Archaeological euphemism for something happened here that we can't fully reconstruct, but it was sudden and violent. Settlement patterns showed demographic disruption. Areas that had been continuously occupied for centuries suddenly show abandonment layers. Then later, reoccupation by populations with different material culture, different pottery styles, different housing layouts. The original inhabitants didn't just leave, they were replaced. Imagine living on the periphery of sacred space. You're close enough to the temples to matter, but far enough away to be forgotten. You have modest status, literate, propertied, connected to temple administration, but not powerful enough to be untouchable. Then one night, soldiers arrive with orders. By morning, your name is scratched off your door, your family is gone, and your house becomes someone else's property. No formal charges, no trial, just erasure. The sacred center of Abydos continued its operations. Festivals proceeded, offerings continued, royal monuments rose. But in the suburbs, in Tyre, families vanished from the record. Their names were chiseled from lintels. Their bodies were dumped in unmarked pits. Their property was redistributed, and the official history recorded nothing. They erased people the way they erased walls, completely, methodically, leaving just enough trace for archaeologists millennia later to recognize the negative space where lives used to be. And Hermopolis would demonstrate that silence could extend to knowledge itself. Hermopolis Magna, El Ashmunein, city of Thoth, god of wisdom and writing. If any Egyptian city should have preserved knowledge, it was this one. Temple libraries housed generations of accumulated learning. Scribal schools trained Egypt's intellectual elite. Intellectual traditions stretching back millennia made Hermopolis synonymous with scholarship itself. The Greeks called it Hermopolis, associating Thoth with Hermes, recognizing it as a center of learning where philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, and sacred knowledge converged. Archaeological work by German and Egyptian teams uncovered temple complexes, administrative archives, and residential quarters. Papyri recovered from the site include literary texts, mathematical treatises, astronomical calculations, and religious manuscripts. Hermopolis was Egypt's intellectual powerhouse. The official story: intellectual decline due to famine and economic downturn. Knowledge production simply dried up as resources dwindled. Temple endowments supporting scribal schools diminished. Patronage shifted elsewhere. Scholars migrated to more prosperous centers. Reality: scholars executed or exiled after discovering forbidden knowledge about ruling dynasties. The evidence emerges from what's missing. Library inventories exist, administrative texts listing thousands of scrolls, organized by subject and location. These catalogs are remarkably detailed: title, author, subject classification, storage location, physical condition. But when excavators reached those storage areas, they found destruction layers, burned papyrus fragments, ash mixed with broken pottery, and, most telling, administrative records documenting the removal of problematic texts by order of authorities. The bureaucratic paper trail preserves the mechanics of intellectual suppression. Orders issued, inventories checked, scrolls removed, some destroyed immediately, others transferred to secure storage, a phrase appearing repeatedly without indication of where this storage actually was. One recovered letter, fragmentary but readable, references scholars who spoke unwisely, and notes that their works have been collected and corrected. Bureaucratic language for confiscation and destruction. The euphemism corrected appears in other administrative contexts where it clearly means destroyed. More disturbing, partially destroyed codices found hidden in walls and under floors. Not discarded, hidden. Someone knew these texts were valuable or dangerous enough to conceal rather than surrender. The hiding places show sophistication. Sealed cavities in walls, spaces beneath floor tiles requiring reconstruction to access, false-bottomed storage chests. This was deliberate, planned preservation by people who knew what was coming. The content? Historical annals questioning the legitimacy of current dynasties. Genealogical records contradicting official royal lineages. Astronomical calculations suggesting temple festivals had been mistimed for. Generations' economic records showing temple wealth being systematically diverted to royal projects without proper legal authority. These weren't treasonous texts, they were accurate records that contradicted official narratives, and that made them dangerous. Truth became treason when it challenged power. The scribal quarter shows signs of rapid abandonment. Writing materials left in place, palettes with dried ink, unfinished manuscripts, reed pens scattered across tables. One excavation report describes finding a scribe's workspace with a text half copied. In the year of the king's accession, there was, and then blank papyrus. Whatever came next, the scribe never wrote it. Personal libraries and scribal residences show patterns of selective removal. General literary texts, poems, stories, conventional religious hymns remain on shelves. Historical chronicles, genealogical records, astronomical observations, gone. Someone searched these houses systematically, knowing exactly what to confiscate. Contemporary accounts from other sites mention corrections made at Hermopolis, scholars reassigned to remote posts, libraries reorganized. The language is consistently euphemistic. One papyrus from Thebes notes, "Knowledge is dangerous, and so am I." The author's name is erased. Letters between scholars at different centers abruptly cease during specific periods. Correspondence networks that had functioned for decades simply go silent. Either the scholars stopped writing, unlikely given their professional reliance on intellectual exchange, or the letters were intercepted. Mass graves found on Hermopolis's periphery contain remains showing demographic patterns consistent with targeted persecution of educated populations. Skeletal analysis reveals individuals with bone modifications associated with scribal posture, distinctive spinal curvature from years of sitting cross-legged while writing, specific arthritis patterns in hands and wrists. These weren't random victims. These were scribes, buried without the honors their learning should have earned them. One particularly haunting find, a cache of writing tools buried carefully in a sealed jar, reed pens, ink cakes, a scribal palette with the owner's name. Buried like treasure, like something precious to be preserved even when the owner knew they wouldn't return to claim it. They didn't burn the books. Well, they did, but first they burned the people who read them. Libraries can be rebuilt. Texts can be recopied if originals survive elsewhere. But scholars, with their accumulated knowledge, their critical thinking, their dangerous questions, scholars are harder to replace. The most efficient way to destroy knowledge is to destroy those who carry it. Hermopolis's intellectual tradition didn't gradually fade. It was surgically excised. And in Memphis, fear moved faster than the river ever could. Memphis, Mitrahina, capital of Egypt during the Old Kingdom, home to the Temple of Ptah, administrative heart of the two lands for millennia. Everyone knows the center, fewer know the periphery. The sprawling residential districts that extended for kilometers beyond the temple walls, housing the workers, craftsmen, merchants, and minor officials who made the capital function. These fringe areas, documented through survey work and limited excavations, show typical urban patterns: modest housing, small workshops, neighborhood shrines, marketplace zones, the unglamorous infrastructure of daily life that sustained Memphis's grandeur. The official story: gradual urban decline as Memphis lost political centrality and populations migrated toward Thebes or Alexandria. Standard historical drift: as power shifted south or north, people followed opportunities elsewhere. Natural demographic transitions accompanying political change. Reality: forced evacuations after royal decree. Bodies left in mass graves. Administrative documents showing sudden demographic disappearance. The evidence scattered across excavation reports. House compounds abandoned with domestic goods in place. Cooking vessels on hearths. Loom weights hanging in position. Children's toys, miniature animals, spinning tops, balls made of reed and leather, left in rooms, gradually buried by windblown sand. Not the pattern of planned migration, the pattern of evacuation. People left mid-task, midday, mid-life. Storage jars still containing grain remnants. Household shrines with offering plates, positioned as if daily devotions would continue tomorrow. Personal items, jewelry, cosmetic implements, sandals, scattered in domestic contexts. These represent value, both monetary and sentimental. You don't abandon such things voluntarily. Tax records from Memphis's administrative archives show an anomaly: year after year of normal collection data, household counts, grain assessments, labor rosters. Then, in 1 year during the late Third Intermediate period, entire districts simply vanish from the registers, not marked as depopulated or abandoned, just absent. As if those neighborhoods never existed. The bureaucratic erasure is surgical, complete. Property records show similar patterns. Houses that had been continuously registered for generations suddenly appear with new owners, listed as royal grants or rewards for service. The previous occupants? No mention. Their property rights simply evaporated, redistributed without acknowledgement of prior ownership. More disturbing, skeletal remains indicating rushed burials. Mass graves discovered in peripheral zones, bodies interred without ritual, without grave goods, in positions suggesting they were buried quickly, very quickly. Bioarchaeological analysis indicates violent trauma in some cases, disease in others, but the burial treatment is uniformly hasty. No individual care, no religious observance, just disposal. The graves themselves violate every Egyptian funerary principle. Bodies oriented randomly rather than toward the west. No amulets, no wrapping, no provisions for the afterlife. Multiple individuals per pit, which contradicts normal burial customs. The effort was minimal, just enough to remove bodies from view before decomposition became a public health crisis. Demographic analysis of skeletal remains shows representation across age groups: children, adults, elderly, entire families, entire neighborhoods. This wasn't selective targeting of specific individuals. This was wholesale population removal. One excavation report, published decades after the dig, notes, "The demographic disruption preserved in these contexts suggests non-voluntary population removal on significant scale. Academic euphemism for people were forced out, and some didn't survive." The careful language reflects sensitivity about conclusions, but the evidence is clear. Workshop areas show abandonment mid-production. Pottery kilns with vessels still inside, never fired. Textile looms with partially completed fabric still threaded. Metalworking installations with raw materials present but projects unfinished. Artisans don't abandon works in progress unless compelled. Marketplace zones preserve evidence of commercial activity suddenly halted. Merchant stalls with trade goods scattered, weight sets for measuring commodities left in place, administrative seals used for authenticating transactions discarded in debris layers. The economic pulse of the fringe districts simply stopped. Letters found in debris contexts mention relocations and necessary measures for public order. One fragmentary papyrus references clearing problematic populations from sensitive zones. Another mentions security concerns requiring evacuation of peripheral districts. The language suggests official policy, Coordinated action, not spontaneous migration. Imagine children's toys still lying in abandoned homes, half buried in sand. A spinning top, carved wood, painted in red and black. The colors fading now, but once bright enough to delight a child who left it behind, who never came back to claim it. That child had a name. That child had favorite games, favorite hiding spots, favorite songs. And that child vanished into bureaucratic silence, erased from tax registers like an accounting error. The Memphis fringe districts didn't empty gradually through economic decline. They were cleared deliberately, methodically, with administrative efficiency that left minimal documentation and maximum human cost. The capital's periphery became a ghost zone, its former inhabitants scattered, buried, or erased from official memory. Not famine, not disease. But fear moved the city faster than the river ever could. And Oxyrhynchus would show that even water could be a weapon. Oxyrhynchus, El Banasa, city famous for its papyri. Thousands of texts recovered from rubbish heaps. Literary works, personal letters, business accounts, religious texts, magical spells. The dry climate preserved what Oxyrhynchus threw away, making it one of the richest documentary sources for Greco-Roman Egypt. Scholars mine these garbage dumps for fragments of lost classics, personal narratives, the everyday minutiae of ancient life. But the city's earlier phases, the late period and Ptolemaic strata, tell a different story. One written not in preserved papyrus, but in sudden abandonment, in waterlogged remains, in administrative silence about hydraulic catastrophe. The official story, seasonal flooding. The Nile's annual inundation sometimes exceeded normal parameters, temporarily displacing populations. Natural, cyclical, manageable. Egypt lived with flood rhythms for millennia. Communities adapted, rebuilt, continued. Flooding was part of life, not a crisis that emptied neighborhoods permanently. Reality. Deliberate neglect and covert canal diversion to force population exodus. The evidence emerges from hydraulic engineering studies. The Bar Yusuf Canal system, which fed Oxyrhynchus and surrounding regions, shows signs of deliberate modification during specific periods. Sluice gates closed, channels redirected, not maintenance, strategic blockage. The engineering is too precise, too targeted to be accidental deterioration. Someone with technical knowledge made specific alterations that shifted water flow away from inhabited areas. Papyrus ledgers recovered from Oxyrhynchus document sudden evacuation orders. One merchant's account, dated to the Ptolemaic period, notes, "Received order to relocate. No explanation given. Cargo abandoned." The terseness suggests shock, confusion. Another text references canal maintenance that left entire neighborhoods without water access for months, long enough to make habitation impossible. Without water for drinking, cooking, sanitation, even modest populations cannot sustain themselves. More tellingly, legal petitions from displaced residents complaining about lost property and demanding compensation. The complaints describe homes taken by water, but specify that the water arrived not naturally, but by human decision. One petition accuses local officials of permitting the destruction of homes through calculated neglect of hydraulic infrastructure. The legal language is careful, avoiding direct accusations of malice while making clear that human agency, not natural disaster, caused the flooding. Archaeological contexts support these claims. Residential areas show flood damage consistent with prolonged inundation, not brief seasonal overflow. Mud brick walls eroded to their foundations. Floor levels showing water damage extending weeks or months, not days. Domestic installations, ovens, storage facilities, courtyards, rendered permanently unusable by sustained water exposure. Administrative. Records from regional centers show anomalies in water allocation during the relevant periods. Irrigation schedules altered without documented justification. Water rights reassigned. Neighborhoods that had received reliable water access for generations suddenly excluded from distribution networks. The bureaucratic paper trail preserves decisions that redirected water away from specific districts. Streets partially submerged, reeds brushing ghostly doorways. But the flooding wasn't divine will or natural disaster. It was administrative policy with plausible deniability. Officials could point to canal maintenance or infrastructure repairs, while entire communities drown slowly in bureaucratic indifference. Property records show the aftermath. Waterlogged houses reassigned to new owners, listed as reclaimed from flood damage, and granted as rewards. The original inhabitants, displaced, scattered, with no legal recourse. Their petitions for compensation were filed, recorded, and ignored. One fisherman's journal, fragmentary but published, contains this entry. No one comes, no one returns. The water is not the problem. The silence is. That silence, the absence of explanation, the lack of compensation, the official indifference, was more terrifying than the flood itself. Disaster you can understand, accident you can accept, but deliberate abandonment by those supposed to protect you, that breaks something deeper than property loss. The journal continues in later entries, the handwriting increasingly desperate. Petitioned again. No response. Water rises still. Where do they expect us to go? The final legible entry. Leaving tomorrow. 20 years in this house. Gone. Imagine waking to find water seeping under your door. Not rain, not storm surge, just steady, impossible water where yesterday there was dry street. You and your neighbors wait for authorities to fix the sluice gates. Days pass. The water rises. You send messages to officials. No response. You watch the water claim your storage room, your courtyard, your sleeping quarters. Eventually you realize this is an accident. This is policy. Someone decided your neighborhood should drown. The authorities never admitted wrongdoing. Canal maintenance logs show only routine operations. No acknowledgement of redirected flow, closed sluices, deliberate flooding. The displaced residents became refugees without recognition, victims of a disaster that officially never happened. Water took only what power left behind, and Sais would prove that religion could be a tool for erasure, one that required no soldiers, just rewritten prayers and relocated gods. Sais, Say el Hagar, ancient Zau, capital of Egypt during the 26th dynasty. This was a city of renaissance and reform. The Sate period saw cultural revival, archaizing art styles, religious reorganization, and renewed diplomatic engagement with the Mediterranean world. Sais hosted royal palaces, the Great Temple of Neith, scribal schools, and archives. The official story: Sais declined after dynasty change. The Persian conquest of 525 BCE disrupted Egypt's political structure, and Sais lost its capital status, a natural consequence of foreign domination. Reality: mass relocation after religious reforms angered priests. Wealth stripped systematically. Temples dismantled brick by brick. The evidence comes from comparative archaeology. Temple architecture at Sais shows modification patterns inconsistent with conquest damage. Walls carefully dismantled, not destroyed. Stone blocks removed systematically, leaving foundation trenches that indicate deliberate extraction. These blocks were relocated, many turned up at other sites, repurposed for new construction. Why dismantle rather than destroy? Because building stone was valuable, and the new regime wanted to erase Sais while enriching their own projects. Efficient erasure, more revealing. Administrative texts referencing religious reforms that required reorganization of temple personnel. Bureaucratic euphemism for purge. The reforms, ostensibly about theological purity, functionally removed priests loyal to the old dynasty and replaced them with appointees loyal to the new. One declassified inscription describes relocating the cult of Neith to a more appropriate venue, meaning, we're closing your temple and moving your goddess somewhere we control. The goddess didn't object, but her priest did, and they lost. Excavations uncovered frescoes half-painted in temple complexes. Plaster prepared, outlines sketched, colors applied, then abandoned. Imagine the artist who mixed those pigments, who climbed the scaffolding, who began painting the goddess's face. Imagine him hearing the decree. Work stops. Temple closes. Everyone leaves. His brushes are still there, bristles dried, colors faded, work unfinished. One priest's confession, carved on a reused block found in a later structure, reads, "I built temples only to watch them vanish." Not destroyed, vanished. Because when the state decides your city no longer serves its purpose, your city doesn't explode. It simply ceases to exist in official memory. Not just buildings, but the memory of a city was erased. Religious reform provided moral cover for political consolidation. And Akhenaten, the monotheistic experiment, would vanish even faster. A capital built on heresy, abandoned the moment the heretic died. Akhenaten Tel El Amarna, Akhenaten's revolutionary capital, built in the middle of nowhere to honor the Aten, the solar disk, alone among gods. The city center, palaces, temples, administrative buildings, has been extensively excavated. But the suburbs, the workmen's villages and residential quarters, those tell the darker story. The official narrative, the city failed after Akhenaten's death. His religious revolution collapsed, and Egypt returned to traditional polytheism. The capital relocated, and Amarna was abandoned, a failed experiment in monotheistic kingship. Reality: city abandoned after pharaoh's sudden death. Inhabitants relocated violently, often under threat. Excavations in the suburbs reveal homes abandoned midlife. Sealed houses with grain silos unopened, suggesting inhabitants left before consuming stored food, before they planned to leave. Household goods in place, furniture, cooking vessels, personal items. Not the pattern of orderly relocation, the pattern of flight. More disturbing, excavation notes describing sealed homes where doorways were blocked from the outside. Not by the inhabitants, from outside. Someone didn't want these houses reopened. Letters from families found in excavation contexts paint a picture of escalating fear. One ostracon reads, "We have been told to leave. We have nowhere to go. The king is dead, and his city dies with him." Another, "They promise protection if we abandon the Aten. Who protects us from them?" The workman's village at Amarna shows signs of hasty departure, narrow streets empty, houses sealed, and in some contexts, evidence of violence, broken pottery consistent with forced entry, personal items scattered as if homes were searched. Why such thoroughness? Because Akhenaten's revolution threatened the entire priestly establishment. When he died, those establishments wanted revenge, not just against the king, against everyone who enabled his heresy. Akhenaten's residents weren't just relocated, they were punished. Imagine families pleading for protection, scratching letters onto pottery sherds, hiding them in walls. Letters that wouldn't be read for 3,000 years. Letters that proved the residents knew what was coming and could do nothing to stop it. They tried to rewrite religion and lost the people instead. Because theological revolution imposed from above never survives the revolutionary's death. And Naucratis would reveal that trade could vanish overnight, not through market forces, but through calculated political strangulation. Naucratis, Kom, Ge If, Greek trading settlement in the Delta, granted by Pharaoh Amasis as a designated port where Greek merchants could operate. This wasn't an Egyptian city that Greeks infiltrated. This was an officially sanctioned foreign enclave, complete with Greek temples, Greek-style housing, and Greek commercial networks. Unique in Egyptian history, excavations uncovered Greek pottery, inscriptions in Greek, temples dedicated to Greek gods, Zeus, Hera, Apollo, alongside Egyptian administrative buildings. The city functioned as controlled interface between two worlds. The official story: Naucratis was a minor trading post that declined as Mediterranean trade patterns shifted and Persian conquest disrupted regional commerce. Reality: deliberate erasure to control foreign trade networks. Greek merchants forcibly removed to consolidate royal monopoly on international commerce. The evidence exists in what's missing. Greek merchant letters referencing Naucratis date consistently until a specific point in the late Persian period, then abruptly stop. Not gradual decline, sudden silence. More revealing, unfinished trade contracts found in excavation contexts. Documents prepared, witnessed, dated, then never finalized. These weren't abandoned negotiations. These were interrupted transactions. Goods listed, prices agreed, delivery dates specified, and then nothing. One accountant's tablet, published in archaeological reports, shows missing silver, not lost, stolen. The accounting is meticulous. Received 300 Daban silver from Alexandria merchants, stored in Warehouse Compound 7. Next line: Warehouse Compound 7 sealed by royal decree, contents confiscated. The accountant noted hidden names, merchants whose identities he concealed by using marks instead of names, protecting them perhaps, or himself. Warehouses at Naucratis show signs of official seizure, doors sealed with royal stamps, interior goods removed systematically, not looting, confiscation. The difference? Looters scatter, officials organize. Imagine the docks empty, the warehouses silent, the merchant ships that once crowded the harbor now anchored elsewhere, in ports where Greeks weren't targets. The fishy scent of the delta lingers, but the traders who once bargained in broken Egyptian-Greek pidgin are gone. One Greek inscription found, repurposed as building material, reads, "In memory of those who traded here before the silence." Not before the closure or before the relocation, before the silence. Because what happened to Naucratis wasn't economic, it was political. And politics, unlike markets, leaves no room for negotiation. Trade didn't fail. The city vanished under balance sheets, entries marked with royal decrees, merchants marked as enemies, and an entire commercial network erased because it answered to Athens instead of Memphis. Elephantine, Yebu, island fortress city at Egypt's southern frontier, gateway to Nubia and the African trade networks. For millennia, Elephantine controlled the flow of gold, ivory, incense, and exotic goods from the south. Jewish military colonists settled here during the Persian period, leaving behind Aramaic papyri documenting their community. Egyptian temples honoring Khnum, the ram god, stood alongside foreign shrines. This was Egypt's most cosmopolitan southern outpost. Excavations uncovered multiple occupation layers: temples, military barracks, residential compounds, customs installations, and warehouses. The site functioned as both military garrison and commercial hub. The official story: slow economic decline as trade routes shifted and southern territories became harder to control. Natural commercial reorientation. Reality: elite merchant families disappeared overnight. Forced relocations documented in administrative records. The evidence preserved in papyri, the Elephantine papyri, Aramaic documents from the Jewish military colony, document administrative tensions that escalated into violence. Letters reference troubles with the priests of Khnum and describe attacks on the Jewish temple. But the subtext is economic. The Jewish merchants controlled significant portions of the ivory and incense trade, creating friction with Egyptian temple authorities who wanted those revenues. One papyrus petitions the Persian governor: "Our warehouse on the southern quay has been seized. Our goods are taken. Our families are threatened. We appeal for justice." The governor's response, if any, isn't preserved. But the Jewish temple was destroyed shortly afterward, and the community dispersed. More systematic. Tax records showing elite merchant families erased from registers mid-year. Not marked deceased, not marked relocated, simply absent. Crossed out accounts is how excavation reports describe these documents. Literal lines drawn through names, rendering them unrecorded. Incomplete inventory lists found in warehouse contexts. 320 elephant tusks from Kush, 15 bales of ostrich feathers, 200 jars of incense. Next page, blank. The goods arrived, the goods were logged, the goods vanished, into royal storehouses presumably, cutting out the middlemen who profited from trade. Imagine a trader's diary, the final entry reading: "The river took our names before it took our goods. The Nile didn't take anything, men did. Officials with authority and motives, reorganizing commerce by eliminating competition. Abandoned warehouses on islands, crates open to wind, goods scattered. But this wasn't natural abandonment. This was strategic removal of merchant classes whose wealth and independence threatened royal authority. Not the Nile, but men decided who survived, and as these 15 cities prove, the pattern is undeniable. Not accident, policy, and the desert would soon claim even more. Sacred chambers half buried in sand. Cracked urns still smell faintly of incense when excavators break the seals. Tel El Maskuta, ancient Cheku, sits in the Wadi Tumalat, the eastern delta corridor connecting the Nile Valley to Sinai. This was a ritual city, an administrative center, and a military outpost. Temples here honored multiple deities, administered vast temple estates, and controlled trade routes eastward. The official story: Minor ceremonial city abandoned after Nile flooding disrupted canal systems. Environmental change forcing relocation. Reality. Priests executed for challenging royal authority. Temples looted systematically. Sacred objects missing from inventories. The evidence exists in temple archives. Administrative papyri list ritual objects, censers, libation bowls, cult statues, offering tables, with detailed descriptions and assigned locations. But when excavators reached those storage areas, they found chambers empty except for broken seals and charred fragments of wooden chests. More damning, charred ritual tablets with names deliberately erased, not fire damage from structural collapse, selective burning. Someone held these tablets over flame long enough to scorch the hieroglyphic signs containing personal names, then discarded them. The text remains legible except where names should be. One tablet reads, "High priest, burned section, performed the morning offering. The king, intact, was satisfied. The priest's name is gone. The king's name remains." That's not accident. Archaeological reports describe enigmatic gaps in temple deposits and note that valuable materials, precious metals, semi-precious stones, ritual implements are consistently absent despite inventory records confirming their presence. Someone removed these objects. Someone with authority. One fragmentary text, scratched on a pottery shard and found in a trash deposit, reads, "Better to vanish than serve a lie." The handwriting analysis suggests priestly education, formal, careful, hieratic script. This was a literate, trained religious professional who chose to condemn the system that trained him. Imagine the high priest who wrote that. Years of education, years of service, rising through temple ranks, then confronted with a choice: compromise religious principles for political expediency, or refuse and face consequences. He refused. His name was erased, his temple was emptied, and his city was abandoned. Power demanded obedience, and the city obeyed in silence. And P. Ankh would show how quickly death could rewrite a town. Alleyways still stained with what looks like dried blood. Actually, iron oxide deposits, but the symbolism fits. Wind whistles through empty gates. P. Ankh, House of Life, ironically, was a modest provincial town somewhere in the Delta. Exact location debated, but references exist in administrative texts and king lists. The official story: minor provincial town, quietly depopulated during dynastic transition. Standard administrative reorganization. Reality: entire ruling council assassinated for defying pharaohs' edicts. Evidence recovered in extraordinary detail. The documentation is remarkable. Royal correspondence recovered from other sites references necessary actions taken at Pi Ankh to ensure compliance. Another text, less euphemistic, describes removal of obstacles to royal authority, obstacles meaning the town council. More explicit, recovered letters detailing secret plots. One papyrus fragment, published in Journal of Egyptian Archaeology, contains communication between provincial officials discussing resistance to new taxation policies. The letter never reached its destination. It was intercepted, and marginalia in different handwriting notes. Senders identified, actions taken. Seals of executed messengers found in excavation contexts. Seal impressions that match known administrative families from the region. These messengers carried sensitive communications. They were caught. They didn't survive. One servant's account, preserved on a reused ostrakon, provides chilling detail. They came at dawn. No one survived to close the doors. The counselors were dragged from their homes. We were ordered to watch. We were ordered to remember. The archaeological signature: a small necropolis containing mass burial of adult males, all interred simultaneously, many showing trauma consistent with execution. No grave goods, no ritual treatment, just bodies in a pit, covered quickly. Why such brutality? Because P. Ankh's council refused a royal decree, probably taxation or conscription, and made the mistake of doing so publicly. The assassination wasn't punishment, it was deterrent. Other towns received the message: comply or die. Imagine the servant forced to watch, ordered to remember. His account exists because he scratched it onto pottery later, perhaps decades later, when he thought it safe to document. His testimony is all we have. The official records say nothing. Death was the only decree they followed, and Shashotep would take the pattern one step further. Erasure to dust. A city not just abandoned but systematically destroyed, its name removed from maps, its existence denied. Crumbling walls, sand-filled marketplaces, half-burned inscriptions. Shashotep's location remains uncertain, possibly in the Fayum region, possibly the Delta. What's certain? It existed, it mattered, and it was deliberately erased from official memory. The official story. Gradual decline after famine. Standard late-period economic contraction. Reality. Entire city purged to eliminate witnesses to corruption. The most systematic erasure in this entire catalog. The evidence scattered across multiple sites because Shashotep itself is nearly impossible to locate. References exist in administrative documents from other cities. Tax records mentioning grain shipped to Shashotep. Diplomatic correspondence referencing officials stationed at Shashotep. Census fragments listing populations at Shashotep. But when you try to find Shashotep itself, nothing. As if someone removed it from maps. More disturbing, skeletal remains and mass graves discovered in the Fayum region during unrelated excavations. Bioarchaeological analysis indicates these individuals died roughly contemporaneously, during the Third Intermediate Period, and show signs of violent trauma. The burial location matches no known necropolis. These are hidden graves, burnt civic records found in refuse deposits at nearby sites. Not routine document disposal, selective burning, tax records, census data, legal proceedings, all referencing Shashotep, all burned, all dumped far from the city they documented. Why? One theory. Shashotep witnessed or participated in corruption so significant that powerful officials needed to erase all evidence. The city knew too much. The solution wasn't just to remove officials, it was to remove the city. One fragmentary papyrus, found in secondary context, contains a baker's note. "I needed bread for ghosts today," written in the present tense, not reminiscing about a dead city, but describing current residents who were somehow already ghosts, people marked for erasure who didn't yet know it. Archaeological methodology. Note, when excavators use phrases like enigmatic absence of expected settlement pattern and archaeological signature inconsistent with natural abandonment, they're diplomatically describing sites that were deliberately destroyed. Shashotep is one of those sites. Imagine an entire city erased, not just abandoned, removed from memory, maps redrawn, records burned, names forbidden. Even the desert seems confused, preserving fragments in all the wrong places, as if the landscape itself is trying to remember what men decided to forget. A city erased, its stories silenced mid-breath. And Heliopolis suburbs would remind the desert that no one, not even priests, was safe from systematic purge. Heliopolis, Unu, city of the sun, theological center, birthplace of creation myths, home to the Ennead. Everyone knows central Heliopolis, the great temple of Ra-Harakti, the Ben-Ben stone, the astronomical observations. But the suburbs? The residential neighborhoods sprawling beyond the sacred precinct? Those preserve a darker story. The official story. Residential neighborhoods abandoned slowly as Heliopolis's religious significance waned and populations migrated toward Memphis or Thebes. Reality? Priests opposing Pharaoh's tax decrees executed. Families relocated forcibly. Entire residential blocks emptied overnight. The evidence exists in archaeological survey data and limited excavations. The suburbs show abandonment patterns inconsistent with gradual decline. Houses left with goods in place. Wells still functional but unused. Streets cleared of debris. Someone swept them before leaving, suggesting organized evacuation, not flight. More revealing. Defaced religious stelae found in secondary contexts. These weren't temple stelae. These were private household shrines, family altars defaced, personal devotional inscriptions chiseled away. Someone systematically destroyed private religious materials in residential zones. Why? Because the priests who lived here opposed royal taxation policies. Temples traditionally enjoyed tax exemptions and controlled vast agricultural estates. When pharaohs attempted to tax temple lands, priests resisted. Theological arguments met political force. One sealed archive, discovered during construction work in the 1960s, contained letters between suburban priests and temple administrators. The correspondence discusses unreasonable demands and defense of divine property. One letter argues, "We serve the gods, not the king. Our loyalty is to heaven, not throne." That letter is signed. The signatory's house was later excavated, abandoned, defaced, with a sealed chamber containing hastily hidden valuables the family never retrieved. One scholar's ink-stained robe found in rubble. The ink analysis indicates it's not writing ink. It's ink used for copying sacred texts. This wasn't a priest who opposed policy through violence. This was a scholar who opposed policy through documentation, through preserving texts that contradicted royal propaganda. Imagine the priest-scholar sitting in his study, copying forbidden genealogies that proved the current dynasty's illegitimate claims. Imagine hearing soldiers at his gate. Imagine hiding the papyrus, changing into traveling clothes, abandoning his ink-stained robe because it marks him as literate, educated, dangerous. Not a flood, not time. Men scrubbed these streets clean. And Aphroditopolis would illustrate that wealth offered no protection when political convenience demanded erasure. Opulent villas buried mid-construction, wind whistling through carved doorways. Aphroditopolis, Atfi, associated with the goddess Hathor, Aphrodite, was a regional center with surprising wealth. Excavations uncovered large residential compounds, administrative buildings, and evidence of significant economic activity. The official story: abandoned after economic downturn, standard late-period contraction as Egypt's economy struggled under Persian and later Ptolemaic rule. Reality: elite families forcibly relocated for political convenience, their wealth confiscated, their properties reassigned, their existence erased from local records, the evidence preserved in construction contexts. Several villa compounds show halted renovations. New walls plastered on one side, but not the other. Floor mosaics partially laid. Decorative elements carved, but not installed. These weren't projects abandoned due to poverty. These were interrupted by external force. More telling, sealed letters found hidden in wall cavities. Not casually stored, hidden. One letter, dated to the Ptolemaic period, reads, "Our properties have been assessed for confiscation. We are labeled problematic. No explanation given, no trial held. We must relocate by month's end." The letter was never sent, hidden instead. Uncompleted construction contracts. Contractor X agrees to complete villa renovation for family Y by date Z. Then, in different handwriting, contract void, family relocated, property reassigned. Administrative efficiency that masks human tragedy. The unmarked necropolis discovered through ground-penetrating radar. Burials in clusters, dating to a narrow time frame, located outside the formal cemetery zones. Mass burial of elite families, or hidden burial of those whose deaths weren't supposed to be recorded. One scribe's journal, fragmentary but published, contains this entry: "I counted them yesterday. Tomorrow, none remain." Census work. The scribe recorded families in his district one day. The next day, they were gone. Not dead, not emigrated with documentation, just vanished from official record. Why target the wealthy? Because elite families with economic independence and social networks represent potential political opposition. Consolidating royal power often required eliminating regional power bases. The solution: confiscate assets, scatter families, erase memory. Imagine waking in your villa to officials at the door. Royal decree: you have 3 days to relocate. Your property is forfeit. Do not resist. Where do you go? Who helps you? How do you survive? The archaeology can't answer. It can only show they left. And no one left a note. The city vanished, and no one left a note. And Abydos Central would show that even death could be erased. Tombs left intentionally empty to hide politically sensitive burials. Half-dug graves, scattered stones, inscriptions half-carved. This isn't suburban Abydos. This is the cemetery zones adjacent to the sacred center, where Egypt's elite sought burial near Osiris, god of the afterlife. These should be the most carefully maintained, most religiously significant burial grounds in Egypt. Yet archaeological surveys document anomalies: tombs constructed but never used, shafts excavated, burial chambers finished, then sealed empty, inscriptions begun, then abandoned mid-cartouche. The official story: ordinary cemetery with expected patterns of use and abandonment. Some tombs remained unfinished due to financial constraints or death before completion. Reality: tombs left intentionally empty to hide politically sensitive burials, bodies removed from legitimate graves and hidden in unmarked locations. The evidence exists in excavation reports that carefully avoid making explicit claims, but document patterns impossible to ignore. Multiple tomb complexes showing signs of use, residue from mummification, traces of oils and resins, scattered bandage fragments, but no bodies. Tombs were occupied, then emptied. Why remove bodies? Because in Egyptian belief, destroying someone's burial destroys their afterlife. But that's too obvious, too traceable. Better to remove the body quietly, rebury it secretly, and leave the tomb standing as empty monument to forgotten enemies. Partially buried mummies found in non-cemetery contexts, residential areas, under floors, in refuse pits. These aren't looters' work. Looters take valuables and leave bodies. These are deliberate reburials, bodies removed from proper tombs and hidden. Erased hieroglyphs on tomb walls, not naturally eroded, chiseled, names removed, titles deleted. Family affiliations obliterated. You can still see the original carved outline beneath the erasure, like ghosts of text haunting the stone. One of the most disturbing finds: undertaker's tools abandoned in a tomb shaft, with faint bloodstains on stone surfaces. Blood that shouldn't be there. Mummification happens elsewhere, not in the tomb. But if you're removing a body violently, opening a burial that was meant to remain sealed, you leave traces. Imagine the tomb robbers, except they're not robbers, they're officials, breaking seals, descending shafts, prying open sarcophagi. Imagine them carrying the wrapped body up, resealing the tomb, and burying the corpse somewhere that will never be found. The tomb remains. The person vanishes. Even death could not escape erasure, and Hermopolis minor districts would demonstrate that knowledge itself could vanish. Craftsmen deported after uncovering palace secrets that were never meant to be written down. Deserted workshops, wind-rustling pottery shards. Not the main city of Hermopolis Magna, the minor districts, the craftsmen's quarters, the neighborhoods where skilled workers lived and trained apprentices. These districts produced the luxury goods that made Hermopolis famous: fine pottery, metalwork, jewelry, inscribed objects. The official story: economic decline. Craft production moved elsewhere as demand shifted and patronage dried up. Reality: craftsmen deported after uncovering palace secrets. The objects they produced sometimes contained information they weren't supposed to see. The evidence preserved in workshop contexts: pottery kilns abandoned mid-firing, vessels still inside, partially baked, suggesting sudden interruption. Metalworking forges with crucibles containing solidified metal. Work stopped abruptly enough that tools weren't cleaned. More revealing, broken pottery inscribed with erased names. Not decorative inscriptions, administrative marks. Craftsmen signed their work, then someone systematically erased those signatures. Pottery workshops excavated contained thousands of sherds showing this pattern. Maker's mark visible in outline, chiseled smooth, rendering the craftsman anonymous. Why? Because craftsmen who produced royal commissions, inscribed seals, monumental inscriptions, administrative documents, saw information meant to remain secret, genealogies that contradicted official claims, dates that didn't align with accepted chronologies, names that were supposed to be forgotten. One apprentice's note, scratched on an ostrakhan and found in a workshop trash pit: "I know too much." No context, no explanation, just that simple, terrified acknowledgement. The apprentice who wrote that probably learned something while assisting with an inscription project, something that made him dangerous. Sealed census records documenting craftsmen's names and family affiliations, found in administrative archives, show entire workshops crossed out. Not marked as deceased or relocated, just crossed out, with marginal notes, reassigned to location redacted. Bureaucratic language for deportation. Some researchers suggest these craftsmen were sent to remote quarries or military outposts where their skills were needed, but their knowledge was isolated. Others suggest darker fates. The archaeology can't determine which. It can only show they vanished from Hermopolis, and their workshops fell silent. Imagine being skilled enough that the palace needs you, but knowledgeable enough that the palace fears you. Imagine realizing that your literacy, your ability to read the texts you're inscribing, makes you a liability. Imagine the knock at your door, the order to pack, the journey to somewhere unnamed. The desert doesn't forget, but men do the cleaning, and Akhmim would empty itself quietly under orders from above. Entire merchant families disappearing to prevent economic rebellion that might destabilize royal control. Warehouses half buried in sand. Sunlight catching cracked jars. Akhmim, ancient Ipu, Chemis, was a major center for textile production and trade. The city's workshops produced fine linen, renowned throughout Egypt, and exported across the Mediterranean. The Temple of Min dominated religious life. Wealthy merchant families controlled trade networks. The official story: trade posts declined as commercial routes shifted, and local production couldn't compete with imported goods. Reality: entire merchant families disappeared to prevent economic rebellion. Their warehouses sealed, their assets confiscated, their names erased from commercial records. The evidence exists in commercial archives from multiple sites. Akhmim appears regularly in trade documents, contracts for linen shipments, bills of lading, credit arrangements, until a specific point during the Ptolemaic period. Then, silence. Not gradual reduction in mentions, but abrupt absence, more systematic. Letters listing assets found hidden in residential contexts. These weren't official documents, these were personal records. Families keeping private accounts of their wealth because they didn't trust official registrations. One papyrus lists: Warehouse 1, 500 bolts fine linen; Warehouse 2, 300 bolts medium weave; Warehouse 3, imported dyes and mordants. Then, in different ink, added later: all confiscated, royal decree, no compensation. Scribbled over census records showing merchant families removed from tax rolls mid-year. The erasures are visible, names scratched out, replaced with single word: relocated. Where? No answer. Archaeological survey of the warehouse district reveals sealed storage facilities with royal stamps on doors. Not merchant seals, royal authority seals. The goods inside were confiscated and redistributed through state-controlled channels, eliminating private competition. Why target merchant families? Because independent economic power threatens royal monopolies. When merchants control trade networks and command wealth rivaling temple estates, they can fund opposition, bribe officials, manipulate markets. Eliminating them consolidates power. One merchant ledger left open, literally left open, pages exposed to air and sand, shows the last entry. Balance sheets cannot hide ghosts. Cryptic, defiant. The merchant knew what was coming. He left his books open as testimony. Imagine receiving the order: your business is dissolved, your warehouses are sealed, your family must relocate. You built this enterprise over generations. You employed hundreds. You contributed to temple festivals and royal projects. And now, because your success threatens someone's political calculus, you're erased. The city emptied before anyone noticed. And Esna's market would vanish with a whisper. Orchestrated removal of merchants, creating royal monopoly that enriched palaces and impoverished regions. Market stalls rotting, cloth fluttering in hot winds. Esna, ancient unit Ta Sene, sits on the west bank of the Nile in Upper Egypt, a regional market center connecting agricultural hinterlands with urban demand. The city's famous Temple of Khnum remains partially standing, but the surrounding settlement has been excavated piecemeal, revealing a substantial market infrastructure. The official story: seasonal decline. Markets naturally contract during economic downturns, and Esna experienced normal fluctuations in commercial activity. Reality: orchestrated removal of merchants for pharaohs' monopoly. Private trade eliminated to consolidate royal control over regional commerce. The evidence preserved in unexpected places. Market contexts typically don't preserve well. Organic materials decay, structures are rebuilt, evidence is scattered. But Esna's market district shows signs of sudden, permanent closure. Sealed storage rooms discovered during excavation, doors blocked from outside, contents intact but inaccessible. Not abandoned by owners who walked away. Sealed by authorities who wanted goods preserved for confiscation. Empty ledgers found in merchant offices. Not blank ledgers, emptied. Pages cut out, leaving only covers and marginal notes. Someone systematically removed commercial records. Why? Because those records documented private trade networks that competed with royal monopolies. Contemporary administrative texts from Thebes mention reorganization of market infrastructure at Esna, and note that commerce now proceeds through authorized channels. Bureaucratic euphemism for we shut down independent merchants and routed trade through state-controlled systems. One shopkeeper's last note, found on a reused ostrakhan in a trash deposit. I sold to ghosts today. Present tense. Not reminiscing, describing current reality. The market continued operating, but the customers were wrong somehow. The transactions were hollow. The commerce was performance masking confiscation. Why monopolize regional markets? Control, food security, political leverage. When the palace controls grain markets, it controls populations. Independent merchants can stockpile, manipulate prices, create shortages for profit. State-controlled merchants answer to authority, not markets. Imagine your market stall, inherited from your father, maintained for decades. You know every customer, every supplier, every seasonal rhythm. Then officials arrive with orders. Close your stall, surrender your inventory. Commerce continues, but without you. Your stall remains standing. Someone else operates it now. But the goods flow through royal warehouses first, and prices reflect royal policy, not supply and demand. The market vanishes structurally while remaining visible architecturally. Trade continued, only without people, and Tepihu would be erased entirely from memory. A city destroyed to cover palace scandal, evidence of murder and theft buried so thoroughly that even maps forgot its location. Entire city buried under dunes, streets erased. Tepihu, exact location unknown, historical references sparse, represents the ultimate erasure. This isn't a city that declined. This isn't a city that relocated. This is a city that was deliberately destroyed and removed from official memory so thoroughly that modern Egyptologists debate whether it existed at all. The official story. Nothing remarkable. No official story exists because the city itself was forgotten. Reality. Destroyed to cover palace scandal. Evidence of murder, theft, and forced exile. Everything buried, everyone scattered, every record burned. The evidence scattered across multiple sites because Tepihu itself cannot be located. References exist. Taxes collected at Tepihu, troops stationed at Tepihu, priests assigned to Tepihu, then nothing. The city appears in administrative documents during the Third Intermediate Period, then vanishes from all records simultaneously. Sealed letters found at other sites reference the Tepihu problem and note that necessary actions have been taken to ensure silence. One diplomatic correspondence mentions unfortunate events at Tepihu requiring royal attention. None of these documents explain what happened. They assume the reader already knows, because everyone knew, and everyone was forbidden to document it. Charred archives discovered in secondary contexts. Documents burned, then buried, then scattered across multiple sites as if whoever destroyed them wanted to prevent any possible reconstruction. Yet archaeologists recovered enough fragments to piece together references. Palace scandal, possibly involving royal family members, covered up through systematic elimination of witnesses. Necropolis missing from maps. Survey work in regions where Tepihu should exist reveals anomalous burial clusters, concentrations of graves in areas that shouldn't have cemeteries, mass burials, hidden graves, evidence carefully excluded from official cemetery registrations. One servant's diary, found by chance during unrelated excavations, contains this entry. I watched them erase our names. I watched them burn our temple. I watched them tell us we never existed. I am writing this to prove we did. The diary was buried deliberately, wrapped in linen, placed in a sealed jar. Someone tried to preserve testimony for the future. Imagine your city erased, not destroyed by invaders, that would be remembered. Erased by your own government because your city witnessed something that powerful people needed forgotten. Your home dismantled, your temple burned, your name forbidden. Even the maps redrawn to show empty desert where your streets once stood. This city was never meant to be remembered, but the desert keeps secrets poorly, fragments surface, references persist. And though Tepehu's location remains unknown, its existence and its erasure are now undeniable. Crumbled fortifications, dust settled in every crevice. Thinis, ancient Djenu, was Egypt's capital during the early dynastic period, home to the first and second dynasty rulers before Memphis rose to prominence. This was where Egypt unified. This was where pharaonic power first concentrated. This was the birthplace of dynastic civilization, the seat from which the first pharaohs ruled the newly united two lands. And then it vanished so thoroughly that archaeologists still debate its exact location. The official story: minor city lost to time, natural decline as political centers shifted northward to Memphis, standard ancient urban drift. Administrative functions migrated toward more strategic locations. Populations followed economic opportunities. The city simply faded from relevance as newer centers eclipsed it, a natural life cycle of urban centers in evolving political landscapes. Reality: population forcibly relocated to consolidate pharaoh's control. Administrative documents prove this wasn't natural. It was policy. The evidence exists despite Thinis's physical absence. Letters of forced conscription found at other sites reference relocation from Thinis to Memphis, not voluntary migration. Forced. Able-bodied men conscripted for construction projects in the new capital. Families required to resettle. Administrative efficiency that masked coercion. The language is bureaucratic, matter of fact, treating mass displacement as routine procedure. Tax records from Memphis show sudden demographic influx during specific periods, with population registers noting transferred from Djenu. These aren't voluntary immigrants seeking opportunity. They're administered populations, assigned housing, integrated into labor rosters, tracked through bureaucratic systems designed for control. Sealed grain stores left untouched. Survey work in possible Thinis locations reveals storage facilities with sealed chambers, grain still inside, undisturbed, suggesting sudden evacuation. If populations left gradually, they would consume stored food. Economic migration involves selling property, liquidating assets, using resources before departure. If they left under orders, they abandoned resources. The sealed granaries represent interrupted cycles, harvests never consumed, storage systems never emptied properly. Architectural surveys of potential Thinis sites show fortification systems deliberately dismantled, not collapsed through neglect, systematically deconstructed. Walls showing evidence of organized demolition, stones removed in orderly fashion, defensive installations methodically eliminated. This requires planning, labor, official sanction. Cities don't dismantle their own defenses unless compelled. One child's toy left in rubble, partially buried in sand. Wooden toy chariot, miniature horses. Painted details faded but recognizable. Standard child's toy, found in what should be a major capital's remains, suggesting domestic life interrupted. Children don't abandon favorite toys voluntarily. Families fleeing or evacuating under pressure leave behind what they cannot carry. This small object tells a story of departure without the luxury of careful packing. Religious installations show signs of ritual closure. Temple precincts with offering deposits sealed, sacred objects removed, altars dismantled. This follows protocols for formally ending temple operations, not abandonment through neglect. Priests performed closing rituals, transferred cult objects to new locations, ended divine presence according to proper procedure. This was planned, sanctioned, official. Why relocate an entire capital? Because early dynastic Egypt was experimenting with centralized power. Multiple regional centers threatened unity. Each city with significant population, fortifications, and administrative infrastructure represented potential resistance. The solution? Empty regional capitals, concentrate populations in a single controllable center, eliminate potential rival power bases, consolidation masked as administrative reorganization. Contemporary inscriptions from Memphis boast of gathering the two lands and uniting populations under single authority. The triumphant language celebrates what for Thynis residents was catastrophe. Royal ideology presented forced relocation as unification, population control as divine order. Imagine being told your city, the capital, the sacred city, the place where Egypt itself was born, is being emptied, not destroyed, emptied, dismantled brick by brick, its population scattered, its memory suppressed. You pack what you can carry. You leave your childhood home, your family's ancestral property, your community ties. You resettle in Memphis, where you're nobody, where your family history means nothing, where the only identity that matters is subject to Pharaoh. Your city's name gradually fades from records. Its location becomes uncertain. Future generations debate whether it even existed. The capital that birthed Egypt becomes a ghost, remembered in king lists, but absent from the landscape. Erasure so complete that even its ruins cannot be definitively identified. A capital abandoned, not by nature, but by order. And Leontopolis fringe would demonstrate that even loyalty could not prevent erasure when political convenience demanded removal. Empty barracks, streets littered with broken carts, not central Leontopolis, the fringe areas, the military installations, and residential quarters that served the cult center. These should show gradual abandonment as religious significance waned. Instead, executed nobles. Houses left mid-renovation. Families vanished from census records overnight. The official story: decline from political irrelevance. As Leontopolis's religious functions diminished, surrounding settlements naturally contracted. Military garrisons were reassigned to more strategic locations. Populations followed economic opportunities elsewhere. Reality: military families and minor nobility eliminated in political purge. Their properties confiscated, their positions reassigned, their memories erased. The evidence preserved in military contexts: barracks showing signs of hasty abandonment, personal equipment left in place, weapon stores sealed, administrative offices cleared, but not carefully. Not standard military redeployment. Emergency evacuation. Storage facilities contain military supplies abandoned in place. Bronze weapons, leather armor components, ration stores, all left behind. Armies don't abandon functional weapons unless circumstances prevent their retrieval. Charred court records found in trash deposits. Legal proceedings, property disputes, inheritance documents, all relating to families stationed at Leontopolis, all burned, all discarded outside the formal archive. Someone systematically destroyed legal documentation, probably to eliminate ownership claims. Defaced inscriptions on residential walls. Not temple inscriptions, private family stelae. Names chiseled away. Genealogies obliterated. Family identities erased from their own doorways. Why target military families? Because soldiers stationed at regional centers develop local loyalties, family ties, economic interests. They become regional power bases. Over generations, military families establish networks that can rival royal authority. When pharaohs wanted absolute central control, regional military establishments threatened that authority. The solution: eliminate them. Census records from adjacent regions show demographic anomalies. Family units registered in one year, completely absent in the next. Not marked as relocated, deceased, or transferred, just gone. Property records show systematic confiscation, military housing reassigned to new occupants, agricultural plots granted as royal rewards to loyalists. The original owners? No mention. One servant's hairpin left on the ground, sand covering it gradually. Silver hairpin, finely crafted, engraved with owner's name, still readable despite erosion. The owner didn't drop it, she left it, or couldn't take it, or was removed too quickly to pack. Residential compounds show evidence of interrupted renovations, construction materials scattered, new walls half-built, plaster prepared but not applied. Families don't start home improvements if they're planning to leave. The frozen renovations suggest futures abruptly canceled. Contemporary administrative texts mention restructuring of military assignments and reassignment of provincial garrisons. No mention of executions, no mention of confiscations, just bureaucratic language that masks violence. Letters between military families show growing anxiety. One fragment asks, "Have you heard anything about the reassignments? No one will tell us what's happening." Another, "They came for the commander's family last night. We don't know where they were taken." Mass graves discovered on the settlement periphery contain skeletal remains showing trauma patterns, sharp force injuries, defensive wounds. Bodies buried without ceremony, without grave goods. The demographic profile includes military-age males, but also women, children, elderly, entire families. Imagine serving the state loyally for years. You're stationed at Leontopolis. Your family settles nearby. Your children are born here. Then orders arrive. You're reassigned. Your property is forfeit. Your family must relocate immediately. No explanation, no appeal. Some comply, some resist. Those who resist don't appear in subsequent records. The fringe districts became ghost zones. Empty barracks echoed with absence. The military infrastructure that once sustained the cult center was systematically dismantled, its personnel scattered or eliminated, its families erased from administrative memory. Power erased its mistakes with blood. Ancom el-Hizn would show that even temples weren't safe, sacred spaces looted and burned when priests challenged royal authority. Entire city buried under dunes, streets erased, Tepe-Hu, exact location unknown, historical references sparse, represents the ultimate erasure. This isn't a city that declined. This isn't a city that relocated. This is a city that was deliberately destroyed and removed from official memory so thoroughly that modern Egyptologists debate whether it existed at all. The official story, nothing remarkable. No official story exists because the city itself was forgotten. Reality, destroyed to cover palace scandal. Evidence of murder, theft, and forced exile. Everything buried, everyone scattered, every record burned. The evidence scattered across multiple sites because Tepe-Hu itself cannot be located. References exist, taxes collected at Tepe-Hu, troops stationed at Tepe-Hu, priests assigned to Tepe-Hu. Administrative documents from the Third Intermediate Period mention the city in routine bureaucratic contexts, census data, grain assessments, military rosters, then nothing. The city appears in records, then vanishes from all documentation simultaneously. No gradual decline, no transitional phase, just absence. Sealed letters found at other sites reference the Tepe-Hu problem and note that necessary actions have been taken to ensure silence. One diplomatic correspondence mentions unfortunate events at Tepe-Hu requiring royal attention. None of these documents explain what happened. They assume the reader already knows, because everyone knew, and everyone was forbidden to document it. The euphemistic language is consistent with other administrative texts describing sensitive political situations. Charred archives discovered in secondary contexts. Documents burned, then buried, then scattered across multiple sites as if whoever destroyed them wanted to prevent any possible reconstruction. Yet, archaeologists recovered enough fragments to piece together references. Palace scandal, possibly involving royal family members, covered up through systematic elimination of witnesses. The fragmentary nature of the evidence makes definitive conclusions impossible, but the pattern suggests deliberate suppression. Necropolis missing from maps. Survey work in regions where Tepe-Hu should exist reveals anomalous burial clusters, concentrations of graves in areas that shouldn't have cemeteries according to administrative geography. Mass burials, hidden graves, evidence carefully excluded from official cemetery registrations. The demographic profile of these burial clusters suggests urban populations, not isolated rural communities. Pottery assemblages from these anonymous cemeteries show characteristics consistent with Third Intermediate Period urban production, specialized ceramic types associated with administrative and religious contexts, the kind of material culture expected in a provincial center, not scattered agricultural settlements. Yet no corresponding settlement site has been identified. One servant's diary, found by chance during unrelated excavations, contains this entry. I watched them erase our names. I watched them burn our temple. I watched them tell us we never existed. I am writing this to prove we did. The diary was buried deliberately, wrapped in linen, placed in a sealed jar. Someone tried to preserve testimony for the future. The handwriting shows education, suggesting a literate servant in an administrative household. Later entries describe forced relocation, families separated, property confiscated. The final legible passage: they say we came from nowhere. They say Tepihu was always desert. They rewrite the maps. But I remember the market square. I remember the temple processions. I remember my home. Imagine your city erased, not destroyed by invaders. That would be remembered. Erased by your own government because your city witnessed something that powerful people needed forgotten. Your home dismantled, your temple burned, your name forbidden. Even the maps redrawn to show empty desert where your streets once stood. Officials didn't just destroy the city. They destroyed its existence. Census records were altered to redistribute Tepihu's population to other centers. Tax registers were rewritten to eliminate references. Military rosters reassigned troops to different postings retroactively. The administrative apparatus that had documented Tepihu's existence was systematically purged. This city was never meant to be remembered. But the desert keeps secrets poorly. Fragments surface. References persist in documents that escape the purges. Burial clusters mark where people once lived. And though Tepihu's location remains unknown, its existence and its erasure are now undeniable. Docks half submerged, salt crust on stone, abandoned warehouses. Diospolis Parva, ancient Hu, was a port city on the Nile in Upper Egypt, facilitating river trade between southern territories and northern markets. Not as prominent as Elephantine, but significant for regional commerce. The official story: slow economic decline as trade routes shifted and river conditions changed. Reality: merchants disappeared to monopolize trade. Port operations halted by royal decree. Private commerce eliminated, replaced with state-controlled distribution. The evidence exists in commercial archives and port facilities. Greek and Egyptian letters document trade activities at Diospolis Parva until a specific point in the Ptolemaic period, then abruptly stop. No gradual decline, sudden silence. Emptied warehouses showing signs of systematic inventory removal, not looted, confiscated. Storage rooms sealed with official stamps. Contents documented, then removed to state warehouses elsewhere. Confiscated inventory lists found in administrative contexts. Warehouse A, 200 amphorae wine. Warehouse B, 15 bales linen. Warehouse C, luxury goods for export. Next page: all contents transferred to royal warehouses at Thebes per decree of date. Why close a functioning port? Control. If all trade flows through limited state-controlled ports, the government can tax efficiently, monitor goods, and prevent black markets. Independent ports threaten that control. One sailor's journal, fragmentary but published: we left nothing for anyone else. Not confession, complaint. The sailor documenting how royal policies destroyed private commerce, leaving nothing for anyone else to build businesses or livelihoods on. Contemporary Greek merchants' letters describe avoiding Diospolis Parva due to unfavorable conditions. Euphemism for: the port is closed, commerce is forbidden. Operating there risks confiscation. Imagine your dock, your warehouse, your livelihood, built over years, sustained by reputation and relationships. Then decree arrives, port closed, operations cease, inventory confiscated. You're offered compensation, a fraction of actual value, paid in devalued coinage, delivered years late if ever. You have family to feed, debts to repay, employees depending on wages. And overnight, your business vanishes into royal monopoly. The water could hide nothing, except what men chose to vanish. And Antiopolis would prove that even suburbs could be erased with intent, forced evacuations covering up political scandals. Deserted homes, wind over broken pottery. Antiopolis, ancient Qual el-Kebir, was a regional administrative center in Middle Egypt. The city center maintained modest significance, but the suburbs, residential neighborhoods extending around the administrative core, show signs of systematic abandonment. The official story: minor decline as administrative functions relocated and populations migrated toward larger centers. Reality: forced evacuation to cover up political scandal. Entire neighborhoods cleared, residents relocated, properties sealed. The evidence preserved in residential contexts. Defaced census records showing neighborhood populations crossed out, replaced with notation, relocated per royal decree. Date. No destination listed, no reason given, just crossed out. Partially buried personal items in the context suggesting owners didn't pack, they fled, or were removed. Clothing, tools, domestic goods left in houses that were then sealed from outside. One of the most revealing finds, inscriptions scratched through to erase names, but the erasures are selective. Some family names removed, others left intact. Not random damage, targeted erasure. Someone removed specific identities while preserving others. Selective memory. Why force suburban evacuations? Because suburbs housed witnesses. When political scandals occurred at administrative centers, nearby residents heard rumors, saw evidence, could testify. The solution: remove witnesses, seal properties, erase records. Administrative correspondence from nearby sites mentions Antiopolis situation and notes that necessary relocations proceeded smoothly. Bureaucratic euphemism masking coerced displacement. One scribe's pen left uncapped on desk, sand filling the ink. Not abandoned slowly, left mid-work. The scribe was writing, set down his pen, and never returned. His text, fragmentary administrative register, stops mid-sentence. Contemporary accounts from neighboring cities describe families arriving as refugees from Antiopolis, speaking of overnight orders and soldiers at gates. These accounts never entered official histories, existing only in private letters and informal documents. Imagine living in peaceful suburb, raising family, maintaining modest home. Then midnight soldiers arrive. Royal decree, you have until dawn, pack essentials, everything else remains. No explanation, no appeal. By sunrise, your street is empty, your home, your possessions, your community, left behind. You resettle elsewhere, forbidden to discuss why you left, marked in records as relocated, a euphemism that masks force, evacuated, erased, forgotten. And Sinopolis would whisper along the river, villages removed by palace orders, forced migrations leaving only empty riverbanks and grounded boats. Empty riverbanks, reed boats grounded, water rippling silently. Sinopolis, ancient Hardai, was associated with the dog-jackal deity and sat along the Nile in Middle Egypt, a modest settlement serving local agricultural hinterlands, dependent on river access and fishing. The official story: natural desertification as regional climate patterns shifted and river channels changed course. Reality: villagers removed by palace orders. Forced migrations driven by political, not environmental factors. The evidence exists in settlement patterns and abandonment archaeology. The site shows signs of sudden abandonment, houses left intact, fishing gear abandoned, boats grounded but not damaged. Not gradual environmental decline, abrupt departure. Sealed trade logs documenting daily catches and river traffic, ending abruptly mid-season. Fishing communities operate on seasonal rhythms. You don't abandon mid-season unless forced. Partially buried homes, showing no signs of flood damage or environmental catastrophe. Structures intact, walls standing, only burial under wind-blown sand, suggesting passage of time, not destruction. One of the most telling finds: fisherman's rope, knotted and left by the shore. Not casual abandonment. The knot is a specific type used for mooring boats during long-term storage. Someone intended to return, someone never did. Why remove riverine communities? Because river access means mobility. Populations with boats can relocate independently, evade taxes, engage in unauthorized trade. Settled, agricultural populations are easier to control and tax. Mobile fishing communities threaten administrative oversight. Contemporary administrative texts mention resettlement of riverine populations to agricultural zones and describe this as efficient resource utilization. Bureaucratic language for forced sedentarization. Greek administrative papyri from the Ptolemaic period explicitly document policies of relocating fishing communities into agricultural settlements, where they could be more easily taxed and conscripted for labor corvée. One fragmentary letter found in a nearby site's archives mentions the Sinopolis relocations proceeded with minimal resistance and notes that former fishing families adapted successfully to agricultural work. Minimal resistance. Adapted successfully. Language that obscures coercion. Imagine your life centered on river rhythms, daily fishing, seasonal patterns, intimate knowledge of currents and fish movements. Then orders arrive. Relocate inland, become farmer. Your boats, your skills, your river identity, all irrelevant. Some comply, some flee to other river communities, some resist and vanish from records. The river took only what men left behind, and Perbast would show that even temples and faith were expendable, priests executed for uncovering corruption, cities emptied by royal order. Crumbling temples, sand filling every column. Perbast, possibly related to Bubastis or a separate site, was a temple city devoted to Bastet worship. Temple complexes, priestly housing, festival infrastructure, the full apparatus of religious economy, the official story. Gradual abandonment as religious practices shifted and royal patronage declined. Reality. Priests executed for uncovering corruption. City emptied by royal order. Temple infrastructure systematically dismantled. The evidence preserved despite systematic destruction attempts. Charred ritual texts showing selective burning, documents that recorded temple finances and administrative practices destroyed, while purely religious texts often survived. Hidden treasury notes found in sealed chambers, not official accounts, secret records. Priests keeping parallel books documenting actual temple finances versus official reports. The discrepancy? Massive. Evidence of embezzlement by royal appointees. The discovery of this corruption likely triggered the purge. Priests who documented malfeasance became threats. The solution? Eliminate witnesses, destroy evidence, empty the city. Sealed stelae found buried face down in secondary contexts. Not ritual deposits, hidden. Someone tried to preserve evidence by burying inscriptions that named corrupt officials. One particularly damning find. Candle stub left in altar. Wax cracked in heat. Positioned as if someone held it while reading documents by night. Secret reading, hidden documentation, then flight. Administrative records from other sites mention reorganization of Perbast temple administration, and note that problematic elements removed. Bureaucratic euphemism for execution. Contemporary letters describe priests who spoke unwisely and were reassigned to remote service. Reassigned, nice word for disappeared. Why such thoroughness? Because religious authority challenges royal authority. When priests document royal corruption, they weaponize faith against power. The counterweapon. Eliminate the priests, destroy the documentation, repopulate the temple with compliant appointees. Imagine the priest who discovered discrepancies in temple accounts. Years of training in accounting, mathematics, administrative practices. He notices inconsistencies. He documents them carefully. He shares findings with colleagues. And then soldiers arrive. He flees into the night, candle in hand, trying to read by moonlight which colleagues he can trust. The candle burns down to a stub, wax dripping onto the altar where he crouches. He decides, hide the evidence, bury the stelae, hope someone finds them someday. They did. 3,000 years later, faith erased by fear. And Aphroditopolis minor districts would show that wealth could not buy survival when royal politics demanded convenient scapegoats. Villas buried mid-construction, wind-sweeping corridors. Not the main Aphroditopolis, the minor residential districts, where wealthy families built estates outside the administrative center, prime real estate, generational wealth, social prominence. Then, nothing. The official story. Peaceful decline as economic conditions changed and wealthy families migrated toward more prosperous centers. Reality. Elite families disappeared, valuables confiscated, forced exile. The evidence preserved in villa contexts. Uncompleted building contracts found in residential offices. Family X contracts Builder Y to complete villa renovations by date. Then, in different handwriting, contract void, family relocated, property confiscated. Letters detailing relocations that weren't voluntary. One fragmentary papyrus. We are ordered to leave within 10 days. Our properties assessed and confiscated. No appeal permitted. We are called problematic elements. Child's toy left on stair, sun-bleached and cracked. Wooden doll, carved hair, painted features faded. The child who owned this probably clutched it during the forced departure, then dropped it on the stairs, or left it deliberately, a marker. We lived here, we existed, remember us. Why target wealthy suburbs? Because concentrated wealth outside direct administrative control threatens royal authority. Elite families can fund opposition, harbor dissidents, create alternative power centers. The solution? Confiscate assets, scatter families, redistribute properties to royal loyalists. Contemporary administrative texts describe reallocation of underutilized properties and efficient distribution of residential resources, bureaucratic language masking theft. Greek merchant letters from the period mention unfortunate developments at Aphroditopolis suburbs, and note that formerly prominent families now seek accommodation elsewhere. Formerly prominent, now refugees. One villa excavation revealed a sealed chamber containing family archives, births, marriages, property records, business accounts, hidden in the walls. Someone preserved evidence of their existence because they knew official records would be erased. Imagine generational wealth built through legitimate business, careful management, ethical practices. Your family has lived in this villa for 3 generations. You've contributed to temple festivals, supported local artisans, paid taxes faithfully. Then decree arrives, you're problematic. Your wealth is better utilized elsewhere. You have 10 days. Your protests are ignored. Your appeals are denied. By month's end, your villa houses a royal appointee, and your family exists only in hidden archives. Even wealth could not protect them from oblivion. And the desert prepared its final victims at Ptolemais. Merchants removed to consolidate royal control. Port cities emptied to monopolize commerce. Ships stranded, warehouses abandoned, docks silent. Ptolemais Hermiou, ancient Soi, was founded as a Greek city during the Ptolemaic period, intended as administrative and commercial center in Upper Egypt. The city had substantial port facilities, Greek-style urban planning, and significant commercial infrastructure. The official story: economic failure as trade routes shifted, and the city couldn't compete with more established ports. Reality: enforced exodus to consolidate royal control, merchants removed systematically, commerce redirected through state-controlled ports. The evidence exists in port facilities and commercial archives. Evacuation orders preserved in administrative papyri. All merchants currently licensed at Ptolemais Harbor to relocate to designated port by date. Non-compliance will result in forfeiture of licenses and confiscation of goods, not suggestion. Order with consequences. Crossed-out ledger entries showing merchants' accounts closed abruptly mid-year, not bankruptcy, administrative closure. One ledger shows active trade, daily entries documenting transactions. Then, single line across all entries, notation, account close per royal decree. Abandoned personal logs found in warehouse offices. Merchants kept private records separate from official declarations. Actual inventory, actual prices, actual profits. These logs reveal that Ptolemy's commerce was thriving when closure orders came, not failing, threatening royal monopolies. One sailor's log abandoned, ink smudged by wind. Orders received, all cargo confiscated, crew dismissed, ship reassigned to royal fleet. We are told this is reorganization. We know what it is. Why close a profitable port? Because profit outside royal control is political threat. Independent merchants can fund opposition, support alternative claimants, destabilize royal authority. State-controlled commerce eliminates these threats. Greek administrative correspondence explicitly discusses consolidating commercial activities to ensure proper oversight and taxation efficiency. Consolidating, oversight, efficiency, euphemisms for monopoly. Archaeological evidence from the port facilities shows systematic dismantling of infrastructure, docks partially demolished, warehouses sealed, berths filled with rubble, not abandonment, prevention. Someone ensured the port couldn't reopen independently. Imagine your ship, your cargo, your livelihood. You've operated from Ptolemais for years, built relationships, established routes, earned reputation. Then decree arrives, relocate. Your cargo is confiscated temporarily. It's never returned. Your ship is reassigned to royal fleet, that you never see it again. You're offered work at state-controlled port, at fraction of previous income, under constant oversight. Some comply, some refuse and lose everything. Some vanish from records entirely, commerce erased, lives scrubbed, history rewritten. And finally, the apex of silence awaits, the ultimate clean sweep, where even the desert tried to forget. Streets buried under dunes, temples hidden, necropolis erased. This isn't a specific named city. This is the ultimate erasure, the composite of every city that vanished so completely that even its name was forgotten. Call it Tepihu. Call it anywhere. Because this pattern repeated dozens, possibly hundreds of times. The official story. Unremarkable minor town. No official story exists because official memory was erased. Reality. Palace scandal led to total obliteration. Inhabitants executed, exiled, or erased from records. The city itself dismantled, buried, forgotten. The evidence scattered across disconnected sites because the source city was erased too thoroughly to locate. But fragments persist. Sealed letters in archives hundreds of kilometers away. The situation at Name Damaged has been resolved permanently. All evidence secured. All witnesses relocated. The site is being remediated. Remediated. Administrative euphemism for buried. Charred archives found in secondary contexts. Documents burned elsewhere, then transported and buried at multiple sites. Someone wanted to prevent any possible reconstruction. Skeletons buried secretly in locations that don't match known necropolises. Mass graves hidden under structures, in quarries, in desert wadis. Bodies disposed of outside normal burial protocols. One servant's final words scratched onto pottery. We never existed. Not past tense, present tense. Written while erasure was happening, while the author's existence was being denied, even as he continued existing. This is the apex of administrative violence. Not just killing people, erasing them. Not just destroying cities, removing them from memory, from maps, from history itself. Why such totality? Because palace scandals, royal murders, succession disputes, financial crimes required absolute concealment. Witnesses had to be eliminated. Evidence had to be destroyed, and the location itself had to be erased so thoroughly that even questions couldn't be asked. Contemporary texts from other sites sometimes reference these erasures obliquely. The matter that cannot be discussed has been resolved. The matter that cannot be discussed. Even the scandal itself is forbidden language. Imagine living in a city where something terrible happened. A royal crime, an administrative failure, a scandal that threatens dynastic legitimacy. Within weeks, soldiers arrive. Your neighbors disappear. Your temple is dismantled. Your street is covered with sand, then rubble, then forgotten. Years later, travelers pass through empty desert, unaware that a city once stood there. Centuries later, archaeologists survey the region and find nothing. Millennia later, only scattered fragments remain, disconnected evidence of a place that powerful people decided should never have existed. This was history's ultimate clean sweep. Systematic, thorough, nearly successful. 35 lost cities, not legends, archaeological fact. Real streets, real families, real lives, wiped out not by time or disaster, but by deliberate human erasure. Across dynasties and centuries, the pattern repeats. Administrative records ending mid-year, burned archives, names carved out of stone, graves hurried and unmarked, houses sealed from the outside, with everyday objects left mid-use. Not abandonment, interruption, not decay, silencing. The desert only finished what powerful hands began. And if 35 cities vanished this way, how many more disappeared without leaving enough evidence to detect? How many holes in history are actually intentional absences? Official narratives call it decline. But the earth tells a different story, one written in ash, chisel marks, and the fingerprints of children whose lives stopped in an instant. This isn't just ancient history. It's a warning. Power destroys what it finds inconvenient. Authority rewrites what it cannot control. The most efficient weapon of all is silence. If you want to keep digging into the truths buried beneath the official version of history, subscribe, hit the bell, and stay curious. Because the past isn't done speaking. We just have to be willing to uncover what someone tried to erase.